Welcome to Project Blueprint, the podcast where we bring you the untold stories of great accomplishments and the leaders behind them. I'm Will Heinzel, a former Air Force officer turned program manager at AWS, where I specialize in building data centers.
And I'm Stephen Lasky, a software development engineer at Amazon Web Services, where I develop machine learning applications. In this podcast, we tell stories of how great teams solve problems and deliver results where no one else could. We also discuss how these lessons apply to our own work, whether you're managing a project, leading a team, or just looking for some solid inspiration.
Today, we're excited to tell the story of the most iconic skyscraper in the world, the Empire State Building. It's one of the most impressive modern-day construction projects, but it's also a story of commercial success and failure, ruthless competition, and extraordinary teamwork.
I am so excited. Let's get started.
Let's do it.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This is Project Blueprint, the stories of legendary projects and the leaders behind them.
The Empire State Building is a building that needs no introduction. It's one of the most iconic and famous buildings in the world. It's located in Midtown Manhattan in New York City. It stands 1,250 feet tall with 102 stories and 2.1 million square feet of rentable office space. It's actually so large that it has its own zip code. What's incredible is that this tall building was built in 1931, almost 100 years ago. It was actually the tallest building in the world from 1931 to 1971, or about 40 years, which is the longest span to hold the tallest building crown for any modern skyscraper. So, Stephen, I'm personally really excited to do this episode. You know, my background is in civil engineering. I studied structural engineering for my master's program, so I love buildings, and especially skyscrapers are one of the most extreme forms of architecture and engineering.
So we've got an exciting story to share, and we're going to start in the glamorous, fast-paced era of economic boom and social change, the Roaring '20s.
So, Stephen, to understand how the Empire State Building was built, first, we need to understand the era in which it was built in. And that was a special time in American history, the 1920s, or the Roaring '20s, as we call it now. So this was a time of economic prosperity, and it's an economic boom for the entire country, but especially in New York. So this is the time in New York when there's a lot of immigration, a lot of industrialization, the population is exploding, and there's also a building boom going on. And I think the state of New York's motto really sums up this time and the spirit that drove this era. And the motto is Excelsior, which is Latin for ever higher. So it's this time of optimism and pushing the limits. It's also a really business-friendly environment at the time. Calvin Coolidge was the president during most of the 20s, and he has this quote that I think sums up the country's attitude towards business at the time. He says, "The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there." So everyone is driven with this passion to expand, to build more, to make money, and it's really an economic boom time. Like I said, this also extends to architecture, and Daniel Burnham, a famous Chicago architect, said, quote, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high in hope and work." So you can see how this idea of ambition and economic prosperity is channeled into the buildings that people build also. And the quintessential invention of this era of industrialization and economic boom is the skyscraper. And so this is a new type of building at the time. And there are basically two reasons people are building skyscrapers. One is an economic reason, and then one is a technological reason. So kind of first comes the technological breakthrough that allows for skyscrapers. So before this time, most buildings were built out of masonry walls. So that's like brick or stone. And the problem with brick and stone is as you go higher, the building's base needs to be much thicker to support the weight above it. So you would have some like 4 or 5 story masonry buildings. The walls on the bottom floor would have to be like 6 feet thick. This creates a problem because, one, you're losing rentable space on the first floor because you have these large walls, but then two, not much light can get in.
So what is the definition of a skyscraper? Does that start at 5 stories, 10 stories, 20 stories?
So it's a fuzzy definition, and it evolves as buildings grow taller. Mm-hmm. So like some of the first skyscrapers in Chicago are kind of skyscrapers in air quotes. They're like 10 stories or so. Like we wouldn't really consider it a skyscraper today.
And were those sort of the masonry kind of construction design?
Yeah, some of them were masonry construction, but really I wouldn't consider it a skyscraper because there's one key innovation that allows for buildings to really go higher, and that is steel frame construction. So in Chicago, which is kind of the epicenter of this skyscraper boom, someone by the name of William LeBaron Jenney develops this new idea for a skeleton frame structure after he sees his wife set a book down on a bird cage. So he sees this like spacious and airy wire bird cage that supports the book, and he thinks, why have the walls bear all the load of the building when we could use steel beams and girders and columns to form like a lattice formwork that's going to support the building's weight? So he goes on to build this new type of building using, at first, an iron frame structure, but then he also adds the innovation of using steel, because steel is being produced for a lot of the railroads.
So where did steel come from? Had steel been around for a long time at this point, and they just recently decided to start kind of using it? Or is this a relatively new innovation?
Yeah, so it was an innovation in the economic availability of steel, basically, because steel had been around for a long time, but not in large enough quantities to be economical.
I see.
So the big change here for steel frame construction is that the walls no longer need to bear the load of the building. The walls just become like a curtain. And this is where we get the idea of the curtain wall, where the walls are just hanging from the beams and girders of this steel structure. So you don't need to make them out of thick masonry or anything. The actual support structure for the building is this interior cage, kind of like a human skeleton holds up your body. And in his book, Higher, Bascom sums up this idea really well. Quote, "Height quickly became a question of will and money rather than engineering." So this skyscraper boom originated in Chicago, but it started quickly spreading to New York. And the first really large skyscraper in New York was the Woolworth Building, which opened in 1913. And this was the tallest building in New York at the time, at 792 feet. So the Woolworth Building kicked off a boom of skyscraper construction in Manhattan, and this continued up into the 20s. And during the 20s, the total volume of office space in Manhattan nearly doubled.
Was this also sort of driven by America moving towards more of like a white-collar economy?
Yes, this was driven in part by a lot of new office jobs on the island of Manhattan. But then also, New York was the epicenter of immigration into the U.S. So its population absolutely exploded, which drove demand for more housing, more buildings, more people working in the area. So also interestingly, this was the beginnings of people starting to commute to work because the automobile is starting to become popular. The first subways are being built in Manhattan. And so you have people who can now live on the outskirts and the suburbs of the city and then commute into Manhattan Island for work. So steel frame construction was the technological enabler for skyscraper construction, but the primary driver for these skyscrapers actually being built was economics first and foremost. And a lot of skyscraper construction started in New York because of the rising land values at the time. Land values ballooned to the point where for a developer to make a plot of land on Manhattan Island economically viable, they had to go up.
Yeah, you had to go vertical.
You had to have a certain number of stories just to make your investment even worth it. And one quote that really sums up the idea that skyscrapers were first and foremost an economic invention is by Cass Gilbert, who was a famous architect of the time. He said a skyscraper is, quote, a machine that makes the land pay.
Okay, so we're in the roaring 20s, lots of optimism. And the skyscraper boom starts to happen, and it's driven for several reasons. We have the use of steel as sort of an endoskeleton for buildings, which allows you to build taller. We have a lot of sort of speculation at the time, economically, a lot of investment. We have a much greater need for sort of vertical buildings because New York City is sort of this center of immigration. So a lot going on, lots happening here.
Yeah, and what's important to remember here is that skyscrapers were conceived initially as an economic venture. You know, compared to great forms of building in the past, like a temple or a cathedral that were religious or for other purposes, skyscrapers are meeting a practical need on the island of Manhattan driven by economic considerations. And the people who are building these skyscrapers are businessmen, and they are concerned with making a profit. But like we said, this is a time of excess and optimism, economic boom, spirits are high. So that doesn't mean these are strictly practical ventures, and it quickly becomes a race to see who can build the tallest skyscraper. So, if height is now only a question of will and money, who will be the one to build the world's tallest? So, Stephen, what if I told you that the men primarily responsible for building the tallest building in the world were not architects, not engineers, not city planners, but instead an unlikely pairing of a businessman and a politician?
That would surprise me.
So we're going to start with the businessman. This is John Jacob Raskob. He was born to a poor Irish Catholic family in a New York industrial town in 1879. And he had a rough childhood. His father died when he was 19, and at that point he became the sole provider for his family. After paying off his father's debts, he brought the family together and realized they only had $25 to their name. So he said to everyone, "We are never going to be in this position again," and set out to make that a reality. So he started as a stenographer, which is basically like someone who writes down dictation. It's not really a job that exists anymore, but it's like a office clerk type job. And that job went pretty well, but he wanted a raise. And so he asked for a raise, but it was denied. And so he decides, I don't want to do this job anymore. And he writes a letter to Pierre S. DuPont of the DuPont Chemical Company. And he asks to be his personal secretary and ask for 2.5 times his current salary. So he makes this big, bold demand to DuPont, who might ring a bell because the DuPont Chemical Corporation is one of the most successful industrial chemical companies in American history. And they originally started out manufacturing gunpowder and munitions, but at the time they were one of the largest companies in the U.S.
So presumably Pierre is a high-ranking official or CEO at the DuPont Chemical Company.
Yes. I believe he's on the board of directors or something like that.
Okay.
And so DuPont gets this letter from a young Raskob, and he admires his boldness, asking for 2.5 times his salary, and he decides to hire him as his personal secretary. So Raskob catches a lucky break, and he goes to work for DuPont, and they form a close relationship. He's his personal secretary, so he's with him all day. He's in these business meetings, he's being exposed to these business deals and the runnings of a big industrial company. So during World War I, DuPont is one of the key suppliers for the U.S. military. They provide all of the munitions to support the Army, and they do really well. They make a fortune off of arms sales. So after World War I, DuPont is sitting on this big pool of cash, and they're not sure what to do with it, but Raskob has been following the stock market closely, and he's picked a stock that he likes. That stock is General Motors. So this is in the early 1910s when the automobile industry in the U.S. is just starting to take off, and Raskob sees that this new company, General Motors, could be very successful.
So at this point, Raskob is in his 30s, 40s.
Yeah, he's in his 30s, and he's very ambitious. So he talks to DuPont and says, hey, there's this stock I like. I know you're sitting on a lot of capital. I think we should start buying shares of General Motors. So DuPont agrees. They start with a small stake in General Motors, but eventually that grows to being a controlling interest in the company. And then with the help of Raskob, DuPont basically stages a coup within General Motors and takes control of the board of directors, forces the founder out, and DuPont and some of his other investors take control of General Motors.
Wow, that's very interesting.
So now that DuPont controls the company, he installs Raskob as the treasurer of General Motors, and this is when Raskob really comes into his own as a successful businessman. He is the treasurer for this big corporation that's growing, and he also comes up with a new innovation, and he's basically the one who creates this idea of installment plans for car purchases.
This is a pretty amazing story so far. I mean, he starts with $25 to his family's name, gets a job as a secretary, and now he is treasurer of General Motors.
Yeah, it's really a rags to riches story. And by 1928, Raskob has amassed a fortune of about $100 million, and he's become a very influential New Yorker and businessman. So along the way, he's developed this personality as being very hardworking, innovative. He basically invented the modern day financing model for cars. Interestingly, he sees himself as a capitalist first and foremost. There's actually some examples of he would sign documents as John Jacob Raskob, comma, capitalist. There's the idea that you would sign a document with your name as capitalist.
Yeah, I love it.
Our second protagonist, on the other hand, is the exact opposite, and this is Al Smith, who is the politician in our story. So Al Smith was born in Brooklyn to immigrant Irish Catholic parents, and they were very poor. They basically lived in a tenement below the Brooklyn Bridge. Smith's father died when he was 13, and similar to Raskob, he had to take over for the family. So he worked several odd jobs in New York, and then eventually he got in with Tammany Hall, which is this New York political machine that was known for controlling New York politics during this era. So Al Smith uses his connections with Tammany Hall to get elected to the New York State Assembly and become a state legislator. And then he catches his big break when this really tragic event occurs called the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And this is well known. You probably learned about it in like high school history class, but this was basically an episode at the time in New York where working conditions in factories were really poor. And because there was no fire code at the time, a lot of the exits were locked. There weren't any sprinklers in the building. The staircases were narrow. And so 146 workers ended up dying in this fire. Most of them were immigrant women and young girls. And so it was a huge tragedy at the time, and Al Smith became the most outspoken critic against these poor labor practices. And so this kickstarted his career as a political reformer, and he supported labor rights, children's welfare, government transparency, and even though he was in this corrupt Tammany Hall organization, he tried to reform it from within, and especially was a supporter of the average person. He becomes a really popular political reformer and eventually is elected as governor of New York, where he serves 4 terms. And this really makes him synonymous with New York because he was governor for so long. He was really well respected by the people. He was known as a champion of the average man, and he was one of the most beloved politicians of the time. And so Al Smith is someone who has a really charismatic personality. He's known for being very compassionate, like we mentioned, his various efforts to reform labor movements and children's welfare, and he did all this in a genuine way. He really cared about the people of New York. He grew up in the slums of New York and made it to one of the most powerful political offices in the state.
So we have these two characters, similar backgrounds or certainly similar upbringings, both started very poor, and they kind of work their way up into positions of significant power. How would you say these two are sort of opposites?
Yeah, so they definitely share a similar background, but at first pass, they're almost two different people. So during this period, The Republican Party is the party of big business. Raskob is a businessman, and so he's kind of naturally a Republican. Whereas Smith is a Democrat, and the Democratic Party in this time period is the party that supports workers' rights. And Raskob is more of this ruthless businessman who will take over the General Motors board, whereas Smith is more compassionate, and he has this reputation for helping out the average New Yorker. But Raskob and Smith did have a few things in common. Like we said, they both came from humble origins and had to lead their family after their father's death at a young age. And they're also really ambitious. They've been very successful in their respective fields. One is a businessman, one is a politician. Interestingly, too, they were both Irish Catholic. And this is a time in America when there's a lot of discrimination against Irish Catholics. And so they have to stick together. And there's this tight-knit Irish Catholic community in New York. And that's when Smith and Raskob first meet each other.
So we have Raskob, who's this big business guy, and then we have Smith, who's this politician, pro-workers' rights. They seem to have, opposite personalities.
Yes, absolutely. But, there's that saying that politics makes for strange bedfellows. And that's exactly what's going to happen in the 1928 presidential election. So Raskob is normally this pro-business Republican, but he has one big complaint with the Republican Party at this time, and that is that they support prohibition. And Raskob is strongly against prohibition, not from a moral perspective, but from an economic one, interestingly, which speaks to his personality as a capitalist. So his whole complaint with prohibition is that he thinks the government is wasting money on enforcement and that they could instead be making money on the taxation of alcohol. So his whole complaint is this doesn't make good business sense. And so Smith, he is basically the leader of the Democratic Party at this point, and he gets his party's nomination for president. But the Democrats are the party on the outside trying to get in. The Republicans control the presidency, and so Smith decides they need to differentiate themselves somehow. And so one way they choose to differentiate themselves in the election is they run on a platform of repealing prohibition.
So then repealing prohibition becomes one political point that Raskob and Smith agree on.
Yes. Yeah. So they kind of have this alliance because they both agree that prohibition should be repealed. So Smith approaches Raskob and asks him to be the chair of the Democratic National Committee for this 1928 presidential election. And Raskob decides to accept because he's aligned with Smith on the question of prohibition, but also he's hoping to become the Secretary of the Treasury should Smith win the presidency. So, in the 1928 presidential election, it is Al Smith for the Democrats against Herbert Hoover for the Republicans. But from the beginning, the election doesn't go well for Al Smith. This is a time when most voters were opposed to having a Catholic president, and Smith is a devout Irish Catholic. He's also anti-prohibition when prohibition was not yet really unpopular with the electorate for the country broadly. So this position is a weakness for them. And then interestingly, too, Smith has this really unique, dramatic New York accent. If you listen to any of the videos from him, he's like the stereotypical New Yorker. And it makes a lot of non-New Yorkers laugh when they hear his voice on the radio for the first time. So Smith ends up losing the race pretty badly. He loses in a landslide, and Herbert Hoover wins. And, up until this time, his political story has been one of unmatched success. He was governor for a record 4 terms, but now he finds himself out of a job. And interestingly, because it was also a year for the gubernatorial election, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected as the governor of New York. So Smith can't even go back to his old job, and he finds himself unemployed. And he was a ardent anti-corruption crusader, and so he always took a small salary as a politician, and he just has a small pension when he retires. So he also needs money because he has a large family, and he doesn't really have a way to support himself after losing the election. Raskob isn't in a much better situation either. So when he joined as chair of the Democratic National Committee, GM forced him to resign from his position on the board because they didn't want to have this political conflict. So Raskob is no longer with General Motors. And then even worse, his 19-year-old son died in a car crash not long after the election. So both Raskob and Smith find themselves out of a job after this failure to win the presidency. So there's this apocryphal story of what happens next, and not sure if it's true, but it at least captures the idea of what happens next. So as the story goes, there is the celebration because Franklin Delano Roosevelt has won the governorship of New York. So they're at a party celebrating that, but Al Smith is kind of melancholy. He's happy for his friend who won the governorship, but he didn't win the presidency, so really he's missing out. And he goes to the men's bathroom, and he starts complaining to one of his friends, saying, I don't have that much money, I lost out on the presidential bid, I don't know how I'm going to support my family. And Raskob walks in and says, don't worry, Al, I'm going to build a new skyscraper. It's going to be the biggest in the world, and I want you to be the president of the company.
Okay, so Raskob and Smith allegedly have this conversation in the bathroom about building the world's tallest building. But where does this come from, right? Like what's in it for Smith? Where does this motivation come from Raskob? Is this just a random idea, or is this motivated by something at the time?
Yeah, so most people just don't up and decide to build the tallest building in the world randomly one day. But you really got to look at Smith and Raskob's background. So they were both really successful, but they lose the presidential bid. And so they're really deflated because they've been so successful in their careers up until this point. And so both of them are looking for some new adventure, some great achievement to do next. Smith especially, he just has a small pension from being governor, and so he needs to make some money somehow. And at this point, during the economic boom of the 1920s, there's a lot of real estate speculation, and there's a lot of money being made in real estate. And kind of foreshadowing, there's already a race going on to build the tallest building in the world. And so Smith is excited to join that race and contribute something to the skyline of the city that he loves so much. Raskob, likewise, doesn't have a definite future, but he's an entrepreneur. He always wants to be building something new, trying something new. And so he thinks, why don't I get involved in real estate? Because he's also excited by the building race going on right now. But interestingly, too, in 1928, Raskob, he knows the stock market really well. We talked about how he had that initial idea to buy General Motors stock when it was underpriced. He's starting to see that the stock market might be over-leveraged, that people are buying too much on margin. So he's looking to diversify his investments, and that diversification is going to come in the form of real estate.
Okay, so just to summarize, we have these two characters, Raskob and Smith, both of which came from humble origins, but they sort of found success in two different places. Raskob found success in business, and Smith found success in politics. But after Smith's failed bid for the presidential election, both had uncertain futures and were looking for the next big thing. But in some ways, these two strike me as a complementary team. Raskob has the money and organizational expertise, but Smith has the fame and public relations expertise. It sounds like these two could make a great team.
Yeah, and they both don't have a solid future now that they've lost the presidential bid. So a couple important things to remember here. Raskob, he doesn't really need the money. He's just looking for the next big adventure. He's already made his millions. And so anything that he does, he's going to run it as a businessman because he's a capitalist and that's his personality. But he's also looking to do something great, especially after his son died. He's looking to do something beyond just make money. He wants to do something incredible. And then the other idea is that Smith is the ultimate New Yorker. He has this thick New York accent. He grew up working odd jobs in the city. He's been governor for 4 terms. The people love him. And so he is going to be the ideal face for a building that would become the icon of New York City. So now Raskob and Smith have the idea of building the world's tallest building. All they need is a place to build it.
Okay, Will. So at this point, Raskob and Smith need a site to build the world's tallest skyscraper. But how do you even get started with that? What makes a good site for a skyscraper?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the most important criteria when picking a site, especially in Manhattan at this time, is bigger is better. There is going to be tremendous economies of scales and benefits from having a larger site. And so that's mostly due to the 1916 New York zoning laws. So these were a set of laws and regulations passed by New York basically after the first burst of skyscrapers were built in Manhattan. So originally, skyscraper construction was completely unregulated. And so developers would just build their buildings straight up from the sidewalk without any setbacks or anything, so that it was just this hulking massive building to take advantage of every square inch of the site. So that was good from an economic perspective, but it created these canyons in lower Manhattan where the buildings were so tall that they would blot out the sun. And so the government realized they needed to do something to change this, and they passed these zoning laws in 1916. And it's a bit complicated, but basically they required setbacks for buildings. So a building can rise a certain height above the sidewalk before it needs to kind of take a stair step back. And so you get like these wedding cake style skyscrapers where you have a big block on the bottom, a smaller block on top of that, a smaller block on top of that, kind of reaching up to a point. But there's one key provision that they left in the zoning code, and that was that there is no height limit on 25% of the lot. So this basically means on 25% of whatever your lot size is, you can go as high in the sky as you want to. So in a lot of cases, that 25% is so small that you couldn't make an office out of that. But if you have a massive site, 25% is still a big enough portion of the site to build an office tower.
Yeah, it's like viable space that you can keep going up.
Yeah, but only if the site is very large so that a quarter of it can still make an office building. Also, because of the nature of skyscraper design, the taller they are, they need more room for elevators to get to the higher floors, and then also more room for the mechanical services. So if you have a large site, you have more room for the elevators and services, and you can still have a viable rentable area. So it's probably obvious that having a bigger site is better when it comes to construction in New York. But at this point, assembling a full block or larger had become almost impossible because there's such a building boom in Manhattan that it's really hard to assemble enough small sites to build a large full block structure. So in a lot of cases, when developers are building these skyscrapers, there's this funny game of like intrigue, and they're kind of secretive about buying up plots because they want to assemble several smaller plots into a larger plot. But as soon as one owner gets wind of your plans, they're going to jack the prices way up. So another important consideration for the site when you're trying to build the world's largest skyscraper is, can you get down to bedrock? So basically, bedrock is the firm, solid rock beneath the soil of a site. And if you're going to be building a really tall, load-bearing building, you need to put the foundations on bedrock. But then the question is there solid rock down there? And how deep do you have to dig to get to bedrock? But Manhattan is famous for its strong Manhattan schist, which is this kind of rough, textured, and really solid bedrock that's not too deep below the surface. And so this is one of the contributors to why so many skyscrapers are built in Manhattan, is because you can dig just a few feet in some examples to get to bedrock and have a really strong foundation for a tall building.
Okay, so Will, we've talked about all these various criteria for selecting the best building site for a skyscraper. Where did they end up picking to build the Empire State Building?
So let me tell you about the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And this is possibly the best site that you could ask for if you're trying to build a new skyscraper. And I'd even go as far to say that the Empire State Building as we know it today would not have been possible if it hadn't been for the unique characteristics of the site that at this time in 1928 housed the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. So a little bit about the history of this site. Originally, it was the site of a farm back during the Revolutionary War period, but that site was purchased by the Astor family in 1827, and the Astors made their fortune basically as real estate brokers, and their strategy was to buy up all the outskirts of New York City. So back when Manhattan Island wasn't fully populated, they went to kind of the edge, and they would buy up all the farmland and just sit on it and wait for the city to expand outwards. So by the 1850s, the city of New York had expanded out to encompass this site, and it was prime real estate. So the Astor families decided to build a set of mansions here. And at this point, the Astor family was the epitome of high society. They were one of the richest families in New York, and wherever they settled and wherever they decided to build their mansions became the nexus of high society. In fact, one of the mansions that they built had this famous ballroom that would host about 400 people. And that became the criteria for being part of New York high society, was if you were one of these 400 people who got invited to the Astor's ballroom parties. So fast forward to the end of the 1800s, the Waldorfs are still living in this neighborhood where they've built up several mansions together. But one of the Astors, William Waldorf Astor, is in this feud with his aunt. And this is the classic rich family feud over something insignificant. But William Waldorf decides he's going to spite his aunt by developing his mansion, which is next door to hers, into a grand hotel. So he opens the Waldorf Hotel, but then to get back at him, his aunt decides that she's going to open a competing hotel just next door. So both hotels are threatened by the competition from each other, but they finally come together and they strike an agreement where William Waldorf is going to build the Waldorf Hotel, his aunt is going to build the Astoria Hotel, and then they're going to link them with corridors to create one hotel, the Waldorf Astoria. So this combined Waldorf Astoria opened its doors in 1897, and it immediately becomes one of the most influential hotels in the city of New York. William Waldorf and the Astoria family built this as a hotel to be worthy of their name, and so it's very opulent, lavish. It has a lot of modernizations that are available, and it's one of the most popular places in the city. But by 1929, when Raskob and Smith are looking for a site for their building, high society had kind of moved on. It had moved further uptown, and the Waldorf Astoria had become a bit outdated and unfashionable. So eventually the Waldorf Astoria was sold to a developer called the Bethlehem Engineering Corporation, and their plan was to turn it into an office building. They were trying to get real estate financing, but they ended up defaulting, and so the bank took possession of the site. And this is important to highlight here because it shows that during the speculative time, a risky venture like real estate, whoever the developer is extremely leveraged because it's very expensive to buy a large site. I think they paid $15 to $17 million. And so before they've built an office building, they're not collecting any revenues. So they have to be able to float the project basically until they can build the building and realize some profit. Now, interestingly, that bank that Bethlehem Engineering was working with was the MetLife Insurance Company. And who sits on the board of MetLife Insurance? None other than Al Smith. So he's kind of aware of this deal that's going on, and he sees that it falls through. So Al Smith knows this is a good site, but he needs someone to execute on the deal. And so what comes to mind is his good friend, John Jacob Raskob, who is the organizational genius and has the money to finance a risky endeavor like this. So Raskob comes in, and he puts together a syndicate of businessmen, including his mentor DuPont, and they purchased the site for a total of $17 million.
So $17 million, how much would that be in today's dollars?
So in 2025 dollars, that's about $317 million, which is a lot, but considering the prime location and the site is actually a really good deal.
Yeah, prime location, it's a full block. Sounds like a great deal.
So Raskob and Al Smith have a site for their new building now, and so they lean on the public relations genius of the politician, Al Smith, to really kick this off with a bang.
Yeah, I mean, this must be a big deal, right? Because Al Smith had just recently lost a bid for the president of the United States. So everyone must be wondering what this guy's doing next.
Yeah, so he's still in the media spotlight. He's still beloved by the people of New York. And he brings everyone together and he says, I am announcing today the formation of a company to build the tallest building in the world. Smith also announces that he will be the president and the face of the building, and this is reflected in the name they choose, the Empire State Building. New York is known as the Empire State, so it's only fitting that the building that Al Smith, the ultimate New Yorker, will lead is going to be the Empire State Building. And then Smith announces that this tallest building in the world will be 1,000 feet high and 80 stories tall.
Now, wait. That's not the height I remember we talked about earlier. So why the discrepancy?
Well, hold that thought, Stephen, because there's going to be some changes before we're all done with this project.
Okay, Will, so just to summarize, we learned that when it comes to selecting a site for building a skyscraper, bigger is better. And we have the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which had basically gone into foreclosure. And then none other than Al Smith happens to be in this sort of unique position where he sees this awesome buying opportunity for this foreclosed property. And then he teams up with Raskob, where they announce a plan to build the world's tallest building in August of 1929.
Exactly. And a few other important things to remember is that Smith and this public relations genius announcement is just the first in a series of public relations coups to come that are really going to be instrumental in driving the potential tenants and attention for this exciting new project. And it's also important to remember the lesson from the failed Bethlehem Engineering Corporation, which foreclosed on the site. In real estate, time is money, and especially so in risky ventures like this. So it's going to be imperative for Smith and Raskob that they develop and build on this site quickly to start becoming profitable as soon as possible. So now, Raskob and Smith have selected a site for their project. Now they just need a design to solve the complexities of making the world's tallest building a reality. So, Raskob and Smith have found their site at the location of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, but now they need some architects to be able to create a design for this building that they want to construct. So they need a design that's ideal for the unique project constraints that they face here. There's a lot of forces playing on this project, and so what's top of mind for Raskob and Smith is they want a design that's practical and economical, because they don't plan to just build this building and then sell it. Their plan is to operate it as well. So this is going to be like a retirement job for Al Smith as the president, and Raskob plans to own the building as well.
So this is a real business venture.
Yeah, like we've said before, economics is top of mind for this group of businessmen. So in September of 1929, just shortly after Smith held that press conference to announce their intentions to construct the world's tallest building, they approached the architects of Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon. And Raskob actually had a history with these architects. They worked for him when he was building the General Motors building in downtown New York. So a little bit of background on Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon. They have this really ideal delegation of responsibility within their architecture firm. So Richmond Shreve runs the administrative side of the business, and then William Lamb and Arthur Harmon are focused more on the design side of things. And they had a lot of experience designing office buildings for commercially minded customers like Raskob and General Motors. And above all, they're pragmatic. There's this great quote Tarnack has in the Empire State Building book, and he says, "They did not view architecture as exclusively an art, a science, or a business. Architecture was all of these, an indivisible whole. They were, in short, businesslike." And so Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon, they're not known for these elaborate designs, and they're not really pushing the edge of new architecture. A lot of their designs kind of look similar to what other people are building at the time for office buildings. But most importantly to Raskob and Smith, they do have a reputation for being dependable and meeting their deadlines.
So I get the sense this is like a sort of pragmatic, economical architecture firm.
Yes, that's exactly what they're looking for. And with that in mind, Smith and Raskob sign a contract to initiate the design led by the architects Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon. So before we get into the details of the design that Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon put together, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the architectural movements and forces shaping buildings at this point in the 1920s. So there's basically two competing architectural styles. The first is what's known as neoclassical, and this is basically a return to the classical tradition of Greece and Rome and Renaissance style buildings. So you might recognize this style in buildings such as the White House, where it kind of looks like a Greek temple. It has tall columns in the front. It's all done in white stone.
Yeah, it's sort of like those pillars, the sort of stone marble pillars.
Yeah. And another good example is the Jefferson Memorial, where it's modeled after the Pantheon in Rome. So this design style became popular in America after the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where all of the buildings for the fair were designed in this neoclassical style.
Very interesting. So we have this 1893 Chicago's World Fair, and then as an outcome of this fair, neoclassical buildings become viral of sorts.
Yeah, basically. And then that also evolves into something called the Beaux Arts movement. And so this originates in France, where actually a lot of American architects were trained. This style was similar to neoclassical, but it also has a focus on grand ornamentation and formality and lots of decorations. Think like a really detailed wedding cake or kind of like a Baroque style where it's just like a lot's going on and there's a lot of decoration on the exterior of the building. This style, even the vocabulary is really ornate. You have architectural pieces like pilasters and garlands and cornices and just all these elaborate designs to make the building look beautiful. The other competing architectural movement at this time is something new and kind of on the avant-garde, and that's this movement known as modernism. And this movement comes out of the new scientific advancements, especially in architecture, where we talked about the steel frame construction allowed for the walls to carry no load because the structure of the steel carried the load. So now the walls are freed up and they just act as a curtain, so they don't have to be made out of masonry or brick or anything. They can be basically just a sheet of glass if you want. And so this modernist style is advanced by several European pioneers like Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius, and they have a focus on utility, straight lines, and engineering. And Le Corbusier is famous for saying, "A house is a machine for living in." So this is a new architectural style for the machine age, focused on practicality.
I'm just imagining like giant rectangular prisms with lots and lots of windows.
Yeah, this is kind of what we think of as skyscrapers today. When you see just like a giant glass rectangle, that's modernist design.
Interesting.
But at the time, this was on the leading edge, and American architects don't really like this new modernist style. They view these buildings that are stripped of their decoration and ornamentation as kind of losing their soul. So in America especially, this third architectural movement starts to gain traction, and that is Art Deco. So Art Deco was originally developed in France, and it began with furniture and kind of decorative arts, but it eventually extended into interior design, magazine covers. It even influenced the design of cars and trains, but then also architecture. And so it's characterized by sleek modern designs, less decoration than the Beaux Arts movement, but it does still have some decoration. And it really focuses on a celebration of technology and progress, so it fits the era well. And it uses different materials like stone, terracotta, but then some new materials like aluminum and stainless steel that were just now starting to be manufactured. And so probably the most famous example of Art Deco in architecture is the Chrysler Building, which we will talk about in a bit. But for the Empire State Building, this Art Deco style is the perfect blend of practicality, but also being flashy enough to grab some attention. And it really demonstrates this philosophical design idea that an American architect named Louis Sullivan popularized. So there's a great quote from the Empire State Building by Tarnack, and he says, quote, Sullivan thought a tall-looking building should be a soaring thing, its natural upward thrust reflecting the frame of steel upon which the walls are hung to reveal the offices, all of which are about the same size and perform essentially the same role. An office building's form should follow its function, which is, after all, to house offices. So it's this idea that what the building's purpose is should be reflected in its design. And so it doesn't make sense to have an office building that looks like a Greek temple because that's not its function. It makes sense for an office building to look tall and sleek, and it should have a repeating pattern because it's filled with several offices that all do the same thing. So this influences the Art Deco design, and especially William Van Allen, who is the architect of the Chrysler Building, and he said, quote, Our tall buildings are wholly unlike any buildings of an earlier day. To apply to our tall office buildings the familiar architectural features characteristic of palaces, temples, and churches is not economical or practical, and it is artistically wrong because it is not truthful.
So I get the sense that Art Deco is sort of modernism, but more stylish.
Yeah, I like to think of Art Deco as a transition between the decorative Beaux Arts style and the modernist style.
Okay, so we have the neoclassical building style, which is the White House. We have the Beaux Arts building style, which is kind of like the Library of Congress. We have modernism, which are sort of these big boxes of just repeating windows. And then finally, we have Art Deco, which is a more stylish variant of modernism. And that is ultimately the style for the Empire State Building.
That's right. But the architects didn't start with the idea to design it in the Art Deco style in mind. They actually started from the idea that the form is going to follow the function. So when the architects go to start designing the building, first they think about what constraints are affecting the design of the building. Like, how do we need to design this to meet the various unique constraints of the site? But kind of the legend, as the story goes, is that Raskob is meeting with the architects and he holds up a pencil and says, this is what the building should look like. I don't know how true that story is, but it at least gives the initial idea of what the building might look like. Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon kick off the design process by doing something that I think we can learn a lot from, and that's immediately pulling together everyone involved in the project to participate in the design process. Because when you're doing design, especially for like a building, mistakes in the design process are much easier to correct on paper than out on the site when you're actually moving around steel and concrete. So they established what they call a policy committee for the design and construction of the building. And I think, ironically, this is an example of a committee that actually works well because they bring everyone together. And in this case, they need to have the opinions of a lot of different people because building skyscrapers has become such a specialized process that no one person can keep all the different constraints in their mind. It's very interesting to me how this design evolves because there's a lot of different forces and constraints working on this project. And the main categories that we'll go through are economics, the laws of physics, the constraints of the site, the unique New York zoning laws, and then most importantly, the deadline for opening day.
Okay, so let's start with economics.
Yeah, so the architects are looking at this project with the mentality that form follows function. So they basically look at this from the customer's perspective, the tenants, and they work backwards from that. And so at the time, the most important thing when you're designing an office space is that it's well lit and ventilated. Obviously, it's great to have natural light, especially at this time, so that you can see what you're working on and people who work near a window are happier.
It doesn't space within 20 feet of a window demand like a 70% rental premium?
Yeah, there's a huge premium for office space near windows, especially at this time because there was no air conditioning designed in the Empire State Building. So all the windows were what we call operable, which means they could be opened up to let outside air in and cool down in the summertime.
That's really interesting. So in the early 20th century, the main method of cooling a building was to open a window.
Yeah. So with this key idea in mind, the architects start with the floor plan as the kickoff point for their design. and they decide they're going to have no office space that is further than 28 feet from the windows, and they decide to put the elevators and the mechanical services in the core of the building. So previous to this, when buildings were just starting to use elevators, it was kind of an afterthought. And so they were like basically bolted onto the side of the building. And there weren't that many elevators, so it didn't really take up much space.
Yeah, because buildings were very short, so you only needed maybe 1 or 2 elevators.
Yeah, but with the Empire State Building and these super tall buildings at the time, you would have 60 or 70 elevators. And so that would just cover the entire exterior.
Yeah, you can't just have this lined around the entire building.
Yeah. So a few skyscrapers had already started to have this design where the elevators and mechanical surfaces are in the core of the building. That has obvious benefits for allowing more office space to be by the windows. And this has really become the standard for all tall building design now.
So here's one question I'm really interested in. What is the most economical height to build a skyscraper to?
That's a great question, because we talked about how taller and taller buildings were driven by higher and higher land cost. And so there's this interesting balance of how high do you want to build the building? Because you can get more and more rent when you have more and more floor space. But as a building increases, the cost of construction gets more and more expensive. And that's because there's basically this upper limit where eventually adding additional floors, the cost offsets the income you would get from renting them.
I see. So there's like this marginal cost of adding one more floor, and then there's a point where that marginal cost of adding another floor does not exceed the increase in revenue that you would get.
Yeah, there's basically a break-even point and then a point of diminishing returns where you're actually losing money because the rentable floor space is so small and you have to pay a lot more in construction for deeper foundations, additional structural steel, wind bracing, even more elevators. So it's this really fine, like scientific analysis of what's the optimal height for a skyscraper. And it's mostly driven on how much you think you can rent the office space for and how much you had to pay to acquire the land. So interestingly, one of the architects, Shreve, participated in this study, and they calculated that the ideal height for a skyscraper at that time was 63 stories. And that offered the maximum economic return based on the criteria I mentioned. So he presents this to Raskob, and interestingly, in kind of a uncharacteristic decision, Raskob says, no, I want to do 80 stories so that the building will be 1,000 feet tall. That's an important number because at the time that would make it the tallest building in the world. So to me, this is a really savvy decision on Raskob's part because he is a capitalist. He is focused on profitability first, but he realizes that making this building profitable is not just about the numbers. It might, this spreadsheet or the equivalent of what they had in the day might spit out and say, okay, yeah, 63 stories is optimal. But Raskob's looking at the bigger picture and he says, there's going to be a tremendous advantage to say that we have the tallest building in the world.
Yeah, it becomes like an icon that attracts a lot of attention.
Yeah. So that's kind of an intangible value.
So how much did this cost?
So the budget for the project was $43 million at the time, which in today's money is about $800 million. And so the return on investment was almost a point of pride for Raskob and the other businessmen in this syndicate that he's formed. And it's also important because they're financing this building through a bank. And so the bank and these capitalists, they don't want any unnecessary expense. And so this is part of the reason that they lean more towards the Art Deco style, because they're not willing to pay additional cost for ornamentation, to have sculptures and all this unnecessary design elements. The next major constraint affecting the project is probably what we all think of when we think about trying to build the tallest building in the world, and that's the laws of physics. And so, interestingly, as we had talked about before, this new idea of steel frame design kind of freed the builders from the previous constraints. So like I said, there's this curtain wall that you have a lot of flexibility in. It doesn't need to be this thick masonry.
It's not load-bearing.
It's not load-bearing, right? And then the final constraint is space, and that's really the elevators. So we talked about how a functional office is very dependent on good elevator service. If it takes you 30 minutes to get from the lobby to your office, you're not going to want to rent an office there. So not only does the elevator have to get you there, but it has to be functional and efficient so that you're not wasting a lot of time in the elevators. So obviously, taller buildings require more elevators, which takes up more and more rentable space.
These elevators go through the full length of the building, so every additional elevator you add, you're losing space at every floor that it goes through.
Yeah. And then there's also another interesting physical constraint, and that's at the time, the elevators can only go so high before the steel cables that they run on can't support their own weight. Because you imagine you have this thin steel cable stretched from the bottom of this building all the way to the top. There's a tremendous load in that cable, and it can only rise about 80 stories tall before that steel can't support its own weight. So that is kind of the limit and where Raskob gets this 80-story idea from. So the third major design constraint the architects are working with is the unique characteristics of this site. This is actually, in most ways, an advantage for Raskob and Smith because they got this large site of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. So they can use more space for elevators to serve higher floors while still maintaining large rentable spaces. But it's also in the middle of Manhattan. So there's limited space available. They can only construct within their site. And then you can imagine how difficult it is to transport materials from outside of the city into the city for construction.
So we talked about some economical and physical constraints on the design. What else is there?
Yeah, so interestingly, there's also some man-made constraints on the design. The first is the unique New York City zoning laws. So talked earlier about how in 1916, New York had started requiring setbacks so that enough light could penetrate down to the sidewalk. And this is going to influence how the Empire State Building rises from its base. So the result of this is the architects design a building that rises 5 stories on the entire site, and then it tapers up for several stories with setbacks and cutaways, and then on that 25% of the site, it rises straight up into the air to the final height of 1,000 feet. And that brings us to the fifth and most important constraint, the deadline for opening day. So Raskob and Smith ambitiously set the opening day as May 1st, 1931. But selecting this date is not an accident. And in one of the interesting historical traditions that I had no idea existed before I started this research, back in this time period, and I think up until World War II, May 1st and October 1st were traditionally something known as Moving Day in New York City. And that's basically this tradition where all the commercial office leases ended on either May 1st or October 1st. And so everybody in New York City moved on one of these days, and it was called Moving Day in the city. And it caused confusion and pandemonium and congestion because you can imagine every office worker is moving to a new office on the same day. So kind of crazy and blows my mind that this occurred for so long. But it's super critical for Raskob and Smith because time is money for them. And if they miss this May 1st, 1931 moving day, they have to wait 6 more months until they can get tenants into their building. So Raskob and Smith put speed of construction as their absolute number one priority. And this, more than anything else, influences the design of the Empire State Building.
So we're in September 1929 when they hire Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon to design the world's tallest building. And we now have May 1st of 1931 as move-in day. So that gives them, what, Will, about a year and 9 months from design to opening?
Yeah, so they don't have long, and there's still a lot that needs to happen. They have the site, but other than that, this is just an idea on paper.
So they don't have a lot of time, but necessity is the mother of invention.
Absolutely. So in these collaborative design sessions that they're doing, they create several ideas on how to optimize the design for quick construction. And so I'll share just a few examples, although this is incorporated at every level of the design. One idea that actually comes from the builders is to use Indiana limestone to face the facade rather than bricks. So they're going to have this steel frame structure, but then on the facade, they need like the outer skin to cover the building. And originally they're thinking about using bricks, but the contractors come to them and say, bricks are really labor intensive. It takes a long time to build a brick wall. And so for a little bit more cost, they can cover the facade in Indiana limestone, which can be attached in large blocks much more quickly than building a brick wall.
But it's a little bit more expensive.
Yes, but they kind of do a rough calculation and they expect that the money spent on materials will be saved in time. Another interesting design change that the architects make is they decide to put the windows flush with the exterior wall rather than setback. So setback windows goes back to the tradition of masonry buildings where they had the thick lower walls, and so the windows would need to be set back because it's not as thick as the masonry wall. Well, all skyscraper designs up until this point had still had a setback because that was traditionally how it was done, and so they just continued doing what they had always done. But Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon, they come from this perspective of form follows function, and they say, we don't need to set back the windows. Let's just put them flush with the exterior of the wall because it's just this curtain wall hanging on the side. So they choose to make this change, and it offers them this unique benefit because now that the windows are flush with this Indiana limestone, they can use the edges of the windows to cover up the edges of the limestone blocks. So rather than having to finish the limestone blocks and basically like polish it down to a nice smooth edge, they can just keep it rough and cover it up with the windows. So this saves a ton of time on the manufacturing of the limestone. So the result of these design meetings the architects have led is a design that's surprisingly more driven by economics than engineering concerns. And when I started this research, I expected that this story about the world's tallest building would be more driven by the limits of engineering available at the time. But it's interesting to learn that, surprisingly, the architects purposefully chose not to try anything new on the engineering side because that would mean additional time, more risk to the project. So the final design is this wide base on the full area of the site, and it rises up to a point, kind of like a pencil that Raskob first suggested. And it has these different design elements that make it appear to soar up into the sky. And so it has this simplified limestone exterior wall that we talked about that has several cool features for time savings. And then it has some stainless steel and aluminum ornamentation consistent with the Art Deco style, but it's not excessive and it's not too ostentatious. And this results in a style that Tarnack calls big, bold, and beautiful. And interestingly, the Empire State Building design was immediately popular with critics and the public alike once the building was completed. The design of the Empire State Building really hit that sweet spot between something new and a little edgy, but not a complete separation with what people were familiar with that put people off.
So, Will, what do you think this design tells us about the people who made it?
I think, first and foremost, the sleek lines and kind of simple design overall of the Empire State Building show a clarity of purpose that the designers knew exactly what they wanted. It also shows that the designers of this building had a different standard of beauty from what buildings were in the past. So we talked about the neoclassical and Beaux Arts movement architectural styles, and that was really a philosophy of beauty as ornamentation and following tradition. Whereas the designers of the Empire State Building, they saw beauty as form conforming to the function or the purpose of the building. So to me, this really shows that the designers, the owners, the builders of the Empire State Building really valued function and practicality over decoration and ornamentation and these surface level appearances. But at the same time, they still wanted their building to look, as one of the architects called it, handsome. They wanted to build a building they could be proud of and have some decoration and not just be a modernist box. And so I think Al Smith sums up the importance of the design really well in a quote where he said, If it is true that architecture is a guide to the study of civilization, then the Empire State is an index to our present-day civilization.
Okay, so now I'm going to summarize what we've learned about the design of the Empire State Building and the architects. Smith and Raskob hire Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon to design the building, who are these sort of practically minded architects. There were several styles that they could have chosen from. We have neoclassical, which is what the White House looks like. We have Beaux Arts, which is what the Library of Congress looks like. There's modernism, which is just kind of practical, big boxes. And then finally, there is Art Deco, which is kind of a more stylish version of modernism. And they ultimately decide on Art Deco for the Empire State Building. We talked about the 5 key design constraints, which were economics, the laws of physics, the site itself, New York zoning laws, and finally, the most important, the opening deadline.
And it's important to remember here that economics and consequently the May 1st deadline were the most important constraints here and really drove the entire design and construction process because, like we've been repeating, this was an economic venture first and foremost. And then also what's going to be important as the building eventually becomes an icon is that this Art Deco design really encapsulated the glamour and the ideals of the Roaring Twenties. However, Smith and Raskob are not the only ones competing for the crown of world's tallest building. During the building boom of the 1920s, Raskob and Smith were not the only ones trying to build a super tall skyscraper. There were a lot of developers competing for this honor, and there were 2 main competitors who had already started this race even before Raskob and Smith got started. This was Walter Chrysler, the famous automobile manufacturer who was building a building named after himself, the Chrysler Building, and George Ostrom, who was a Wall Street financer leading a syndicate of investors to build 40 Wall Street. So to start off a little bit, let me explain why having the world's tallest building even matters here. And there's basically 2 main reasons. The first is economic reasons, which might be a little surprising, but there's enormous media attention from having the world's tallest building. You're going to attract more tenants. It's going to help the building rent out faster. You can charge more for rent because of the media attention and the publicity surrounding the building. That's not to say, though, that reasons of personal vanity did not also figure into the calculations. So all these men, Ostrom, Chrysler, Raskob, and Smith, they had been personally successful. They had huge egos, and they wanted to build a great monument that would live on after them. Also, some of these competitions were a bit personal, as we'll get into when we tell the story of Walter Chrysler. So Walter Chrysler fell in love with cars at a young age at an automobile show. And you got to remember, this was the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the automobile was just starting to take off. And so Chrysler was an engineer by aptitude, and he joined General Motors to streamline their production lines. And he quickly became the president of the Buick division at General Motors. But then he crossed paths with Raskob when Raskob and DuPont engineered their takeover of GM. And unfortunately for Chrysler, he didn't get along with Raskob personally, and there were some conflicts over his level of autonomy. He wanted to run Buick as kind of his own domain, but Raskob really wanted to consolidate his grip of power on General Motors. And so they had several disagreements, and ultimately Chrysler was forced out. So, like any upstart entrepreneur, Chrysler said, all right, I'll just start my own car company. And he also named it after himself, which tells you a little bit about his ego. So Chrysler went into business building cars, trying to compete with General Motors, and his goal was to become one of the big 3 auto manufacturers in the country. And he dreamed of building a building that would also reflect his company's leap to become one of the most important car companies in the country. And so he decided that he's going to make his building taller than any other building in the world and most importantly, taller than the new General Motors building that Raskob had Shreve Lamb & Harmon build in New York. And so for Chrysler, this drive to have the world's tallest building was personal. He financed the building himself, and he was personally involved in the design and construction, making recommendations to the architect and putting up additional money to make the building even taller and ensure that he would have the height crown. To help him, Chrysler enlisted the services of architect William Van Allen. So Van Allen is really interesting because unlike Shreve Lamb & Harmon, who were on the more practical side of architecture, he's more of an artist, and he has what he views as a higher calling to move architecture beyond the outdated neoclassical styles and create something new and unconventional and a uniquely American style of architecture, which is going to be Art Deco. And so he designs the Chrysler building in this very loud, flashy, true to his own unique style Art Deco design. And he also incorporates a lot of car motifs from Chrysler's company. So interestingly, the crown of the Chrysler building is covered in what's called Nyrosta stainless steel. And this was developed by Chrysler in his company's lab to be a type of steel that gives this distinctive shiny and silvery appearance. Van Allen also included gargoyles on the building that are in the shape of the Chrysler hood ornaments. And then part of the brickwork mosaic on the building features images of cars. So the Chrysler building was this really unique Art Deco building that emphasized the importance of industry and technology.
So I'm seeing this recurring theme of personalities being reflected in the design of buildings.
Yeah, and it's interesting that basically the financiers and the architects of each building put their unique stamp on it. In 1928, Chrysler had already started construction on his building, planned to be 899 feet tall and 77 floors, making it taller than the Woolworth building and the tallest building in the world.
So Chrysler has a head start here.
Yes, Chrysler has a head start, but another competitor emerges on the scene as well, and that is George Ostrom. He is named the Boy Wonder of Wall Street, and he's basically a Wall Street financier. At this time, he's only 33 years old, so he's this young entrepreneur. He served in World War I as a fighter pilot and had a very impressive record. And then after the war, he started his own investment bank, and he became successful through owning a lot of water companies at the time. And so he was looking to expand beyond investments into real estate and try to make some money in this skyscraper boom that's going on. He starts secretly buying up land at the site of 40 Wall Street to build a skyscraper that's going to serve the office district of Wall Street.
So if I'm getting this correct, Ostrom and Chrysler have been in a two-way race for over a year now when Smith and Raskob enter in 1929, which now makes it a three-way race for the world's tallest building.
Yes. So Ostrom and Chrysler are basically the two rivals. And then the Empire State Building, Raskob and Smith kind of come out of nowhere and surprise both of them. So before Chrysler and Ostrom know that Smith and Raskob are also competing to steal the height crown, they battle each other head-to-head trying to have the tallest design. And they both revise their designs several times to add more floors and have the tallest building, even adding more floors during construction in some cases. But Chrysler reaches a point of no return when he starts work on the dome of the Chrysler building. So once the dome starts tapering up, he can't add in any additional floors. So Ostrom and Severance, the architect, in what's kind of a sneaky maneuver, decide that after Chrysler has started kind of tapering the dome up, that they revise their design to be at an even taller height of 925 feet, or about 25 feet taller than the Chrysler building's designs call for.
And this is during construction that Ostrom modifies his design.
Yes, so it's a bit risky, but he's able to pull it off, and he thinks he's won because Chrysler can't go any higher at this point, or so it would appear. So interestingly, 40 Wall Street actually started construction after the Chrysler building, but they finished first. because they used what was probably the best building company available at the time, the Starrett brothers, and we will get to them in a second. But the Starrett brothers were able to complete 40 Wall Street in record time, especially using this novel idea where they dug the foundations of the new building while the existing building was being demolished. So the Starrett brothers are able to finish 40 Wall Street in about 11 months, which at the time is a record-breaking construction pace, and they finish in April of 1930. 40 Wall Street becomes the tallest building in the world at the time. It was taller than the existing tallest, the Woolworth building, and Ostrom and Severance think that they've won this height race. But the race is not over yet, because Chrysler and Van Allen have an ace up their sleeve. So even though he's completed most of the building, there's still scaffolding on the dome, and everyone's kind of wondering, is he done with the building yet? Like, it looks like it's completely built, but he hasn't opened yet. And that's because, in secret, Van Allen, the architect, has constructed a 125-foot tall stainless steel spire within the dome of the Chrysler building. And they lift this stainless steel spire up through the crown of the Chrysler building to a height of 1,048 feet.
So this is now the tallest man-made structure on Earth.
Yes, in this dramatic fashion, Chrysler and Van Allen lift this surprise structure through the roof of the Chrysler building and steal not only the building crown from 40 Wall Street, but also reach higher than the Eiffel Tower to become the tallest structure in the world.
That's so cool. So they built this spire inside of the building.
Yeah, because it was basically a surprise. 40 Wall Street actually had the record as the world's tallest building for about a month, until, surprisingly, one morning, Chrysler lifted this spire through the top of his building to steal the crown and become the world's tallest building.
That's so funny. So he did have the world's tallest building for a month, but that was very quickly taken away from him.
But it kind of depends on who you ask. So after Chrysler and Van Allen pull this stunt, not everybody is ready to admit defeat in this ordeal. So the architect of 40 Wall Street actually writes a newspaper article where he claims a skyscraper's height should be defined by the tallest usable floor, not the tallest point. And so this begins a long and storied tradition of argument over what technically counts as the tallest building in the world. So there are several ways you could measure what is the world's tallest building. So the first would be the architectural height, which is basically the distance to the tip of the spire or any other decorative elements. But to qualify for this, they have to be, quote, integral to the design. So as you can imagine, this leaves a lot of room for interpretation, but this is basically the definition that Chrysler uses. And they argue that the tip of the spire on the Chrysler building is integral to the design, and so it qualifies as the architectural height of the building and therefore the tallest in the world. Another argument for how you would measure the tallest building is based on the height of the highest occupied floor. And this is more of a practical approach because it's based on usable space in the building. The argument against the Chrysler building spire is that it's not really a practical part of the building. It's just this ornamentation on top. So this is the argument that Ostrom and Severance put forward, but it's really not a successful argument. In the court of public opinion, the decision is made that the tip of the tallest point is the highest man-made object, and so the crown goes to the Chrysler building. So Smith and Raskob are watching this dramatic competition play out, and there's a few forces at play here. So Shreve and Lamb were actually consulting architects helping Severance design 40 Wall Street, and they're also a little upset when they believe Chrysler stole the tallest building record with this spire trick. Raskob also doesn't have a great relationship with Chrysler. We talked a little bit earlier about how they did not get along with each other at GM, and Chrysler ultimately left. So it's gotten personal between the designers of the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. So After all the dust settles, in late 1929, when the design is underway, Raskob decides he wants Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon to redesign the Empire State to add 5 more stories, bringing the total height to 1,048 feet and making the structure taller than Chrysler's building, even with the additional spire. And so they have this new design for an even taller 85-story Empire State Building, but anyone who's familiar with the design will notice that something is missing. And Raskob also thinks there's something missing, because this new design only brings the height of the Empire State Building to 2 feet taller than the tip of the Chrysler's spire. And that's not really much room for error. So 1 month later, Al Smith calls the press together for another one of his famous press conferences, and he announces that the Empire State Building will not just be the tallest building in the world by 2 feet, but that it will rise 202 feet higher to a final height of 1,250 feet. And so, taking a page out of Chrysler's notebook, they are also going to add a steel spire to the top of the Empire State Building. But they've kind of been reviewing the political situation, and they've seen the arguments that, hey, this is just a goofy ornament that Chrysler stuck on his building for vanity purposes. There's arguments that it doesn't really make it the tallest building. And so Al Smith and Raskob kind of come up with this, you can tell me, Stephen, goofy or ingenious idea that not only is this going to be a spire, it's going to be a mooring mast for dirigibles. And so this is kind of a crazy idea, but if you think back to the spirit of the times, dirigibles or zeppelins were really becoming popular, the new form of technology, and everybody thought this was the future of transatlantic travel. It's kind of this wild stunt that nobody would really take seriously unless it came from Al Smith. So he's kind of spending some of his public capital here and saying, no, we're not just going to put a big ornament on our building to win the race. It's actually going to be a mooring mast, and it's going to serve a practical purpose. The idea for the mooring mast is quickly approved and added to the design.
Yeah, it's like a slam dunk. There's just no argument once you've got it both at the floor level and at the total height level.
Yeah. So importantly, they satisfy both of the criteria. The mooring mast will make it the tallest architecturally, but also the 85th floor will be the highest occupied floor as well.
Okay, so to summarize, we have this intense competition between larger-than-life personalities. We have Chrysler, who's building the Chrysler Building, locked in a race with Ostrom, who's building 40 Wall Street. And then Smith and Raskob joined this race a little bit later in 1929 with the Empire State Building. But the competition for the world's tallest building was not just vanity. There were some serious publicity benefits for being able to claim the world's tallest building. But personal rivalries certainly played a role. Chrysler ends up winning the race against 40 Wall Street with the ingenious vertex stunt. And then as a result of this competition between Chrysler and Ostrom, Raskob and Smith end up redesigning the Empire State Building. They add 5 floors and also this sort of mooring mast to ensure that they win the height crown.
Yeah, exactly. So Chrysler holds the height crown at the moment, but Raskob and Smith are hot on his heels. So a few important things to remember here. One is just how valuable Al Smith's public relations genius is for the project team. People probably wouldn't have taken this mooring mast stunt seriously if it wasn't backed up by his reputation and charisma to really sell this to the public, because there's controversy surrounding what counts as the world's tallest building. And so in addition to building the tallest building, they almost also need to sell it to the public and have people believe that it is the world's tallest. So now, Raskob and Smith only have about 20 months between now and the May 1st moving day deadline. They need to find a builder who can complete this massive one-of-a-kind structure by their tight deadline. But there just so happens to be one builder who had just finished the 40 Wall Street site in record time.
So how do they go about finding a builder who can deliver such an ambitious project and an ambitious deadline?
Before we get into which builders they select to complete the project, we need to take a second to explain the state of the construction industry in this time period. And so in the late 19th century, the complexity and scale of buildings began to outgrow the traditional system of construction. So previously, an architect would directly hire the carpenters or maybe the 5 or 6 trades that were needed to build a masonry building. But as we talked about, now buildings are becoming more and more complex. And so trades need to specialize to be able to address the complexities of modern buildings, because these buildings now have elevators, they have heating systems, they're installing telephone lines. It requires a really complex supply chain to bring all these materials to site. And so it's not something that just an architect and a few trades can manage. And so, for example, on the Empire State Building, there are going to be 60 plus different trades and specializations, all doing unique tasks to build the building. So this force drove the need for someone to manage all the trades, the schedule, the budget, and to coordinate everyone to accomplish a complex project. And so a new profession was formed in this time period, which was basically the general contractor. A general contractor is a company who would manage the building trades, the schedule, the material deliveries, but not necessarily actually perform any of the work themselves. You can think of them as kind of just managers of the construction.
So prior to the 20th century, there was no concept of a general contractor.
Yeah, usually it was the architect who would do all the work because the complexity was lower. You only had a few different trades. You didn't have these complex supply chains.
As time goes on, you would imagine buildings would get cheaper and easier to build as technology improves, but it seems as though we're packing more and more technology into them, which increases complexity, and the cost is not necessarily going down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great thought. I want you to hold on to that until the end, because that's going to be really important when we ask the question of why can't we build this quickly nowadays? But the idea of the general contractor is also influenced by the ideas of the time in the late 18th, early 19th century. So this is the time of industrial expansion, the Industrial Revolution. And so there's all these new techniques in manufacturing that are being applied in these factories. And naturally, people say, well, can we apply some of these manufacturing techniques to construction? But this doesn't quite work very well and is even a struggle still today, because automating these complex, non-repeatable construction tasks is not as easy as if you're building 1,000 pins in a pin factory. But there is one idea that does translate really well, and that's implying the industrial management and kind of the efficiency practices and like the theories of management that are being used in the factories. So again, this is stuff that's obvious to us today, but at the time, it wasn't obvious that, we should develop a system for how we're going to manage attendance on site, or we should systematize how everyone's paid. And that's what these general contractors excel at, is because the scale of construction has reached kind of this boiling point to where some of it can be systemized and repeated, they're going to become masters of organization and management for coordinating this large effort.
This is somewhat surprising to me. On the one hand, it's clear that the average size of a building or construction project has increased since the 19th century, let's say. We build bigger buildings. But on the other hand, in the past, there have been very big buildings that were built. The most extreme example being the pyramids, right? I would be surprised if there was no sort of organizational culture that was built around construction, given that there were at least some major construction projects throughout history.
So the key difference with the projects throughout history that you're mentioning is these were more like one-off projects. So, there was a limited number of pyramids built in Egypt. Something like the Pantheon in Rome was only built once. So there wasn't an economy that developed around it. In all those examples, that was basically the state building a single landmark project. And so they mobilized a huge force of labor and expertise to build one single landmark, and then it all dissipated afterwards. Whereas what's going on now is this is an economic force. So we talked about there's lots of skyscrapers being built right now, lots of large landmark size buildings being constructed. There's an economic driver for this. And so it makes sense for there to be a construction industry. So one of the premier general contractors of the time, and especially focused on skyscrapers, was a company called Starrett Brothers and Eakin. And they were an industry leader because they were at the forefront of developing these new construction management techniques and understanding how you apply these organizational practices to construction. So there were 5 Starrett brothers, all who worked in construction in one way or another. So some of them were architects, some of them were general contractors. They were all involved in construction somehow. And 2 of the brothers, Paul and William, partnered with Andrew Eakin to form the Starrett Brothers and Eakin Company in the early 20s. So William Starrett is interesting. He's known as the Colonel because he was the head of the government's emergency construction section during World War I. So he was responsible for building up these basically small towns of barracks and military bases for training. So in like 90 days, he would lead an effort to build out this entire town with electricity, plumbing, and you can imagine, because it was wartime, speed was of the essence. So he really cuts his teeth and gains a lot of experience in building at large scale because these were bases that housed thousands of military personnel, but also doing it under very tight timeline constraints. After that, William Starrett worked on some of the most important projects of the time. He was involved in building the Flatiron Building in New York, in Union Station in Washington, D.C., and at this point, when he is bidding on construction of the Empire State Building, he's become a master of managing the tactical day-to-day operations of a construction site. So that's what he brings to the team. And then his brother, Paul Starrett, started out as a construction superintendent during the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And he also worked on several other important projects in New York City, mostly skyscraper projects, so they had a lot of experience in these. And then during World War I, he built steamships for the government, which, interestingly, there's a lot of parallels in design of steamships and skyscrapers. And then his skill is he is more of a strategic planner for the company, and then he's also the master negotiator. So the most important thing to understand about the Starrett brothers is they're hardcore about their job. And I imagine this comes from their experience in the military when it was kind of a life or death situation. And they needed to build these either steamships or military bases because the fate of the country could hang in the balance. But they take their job very seriously. There's this quote I love by Colonel William Starrett that goes, "Building skyscrapers is the nearest peacetime equivalent to war." And so for him, he believes that the builder or the team of general contractors can be compared to the general of an army. And he sees construction as this war, and he is the general of an army who is leading the team to build this structure. And because they take their work so seriously, the Starretts have developed this reputation for finishing projects ahead of schedule.
Okay, so we have these 2 Starrett brothers. We have William, who is sort of this master on-site tactical person who can build barracks for an entire army in 90 days. And then we have Paul Starrett, who built steamships and is sort of the strategic planner and master negotiator. And these 2 are these kind of hardcore skyscraper builders that are very passionate about their work and can move very fast.
Exactly. And so they're going to be good candidates to build the Empire State Building because in addition to that long resume that we just mentioned, they also just completed the 40 Wall Street building, which we talked about earlier, and they did this in a record 11 months. But the Empire State Building is going to be much more challenging than 40 Wall Street. It's not going to be just a copy and paste job. So to give some stats and compare these two, the Empire State Building is going to be about 25% taller than 40 Wall Street, with the mooring mast included. But the Empire State Building is going to be much, much larger compared to 40 Wall Street. So to give some perspective, 40 Wall Street was about 845,000 square feet of rentable office space. The Chrysler Building was slightly larger. It had 850,000 square feet of rentable space. The Empire State Building is planned to have 2.1 million square feet of rentable space.
So that's bigger than 40 Wall Street and the Chrysler Building combined.
Yeah, about 20% larger than the two combined. So that's something that's not obvious when you first hear about the Empire State Building, but in addition to being the tallest building, is also one of the largest buildings in New York at this time, much larger than any other skyscraper being built. And so, the Starretts had worked on 40 Wall Street. They were really proud that it was potentially going to be the world's tallest building, but unfortunately, the Chrysler Building stole that honor with that spire stunt. And so when the Starretts hear about the Empire State Building project, they really want to win this job. But also they see this as the culmination of what they've been working towards their entire careers.
So I wonder, you say there that the Empire State Building will pay well, which I'm sure it will, but it's also sort of a trophy of sorts to get that job. I wonder if this almost drives down the payout, as various general contractors will bid for the trophy that is the Empire State Building.
Yeah, so that's definitely in Smith and Raskob's mind when they interview several different builders to build the Empire State Building. And so they go through this selection process. They invite several builders to interview for the job, including the Starretts. And Smith and Raskob's number one priority in this process is they're thinking about, we need to find a builder who can meet our May 1st deadline, because that's going to make or break the project. And so, interestingly, one member on the Empire State Building's board is actually friends with Paul Starrett. And so he wants to give him a little bit of help, and he asks him, what order would you like to interview in? And so Paul Starrett immediately says, I want to go last. And it's interesting because this is going to play into his strategy for winning this job. So all the other builders interview, and then Paul Starrett comes in last, as he requested. Smith starts out by asking him, how much equipment do you have on hand to construct the building? And surprisingly, Paul Starrett says, none. But then he goes on to explain that this building is unusual, and so ordinary construction equipment is going to be useless. And he lays out his plan to buy all new equipment specific for this job, sell it afterwards, and then he'll give Smith and Raskob a credit for the difference. So Smith says, okay, makes sense to me. Next he asks, what portion of the work are you going to do yourselves? And so a lot of the other builders had bragged about, well, we're going to do a lot of the work ourselves. We have a lot of in-house experience. We don't need to subcontract too much of it. But Starrett, again, is a little bit different here, and he says, we're not going to self-perform any work that can't be subcontracted cheaper and more efficiently. So he says, my goal is to build this as cheaply and efficiently as possible. If we can't do that in-house, we'll find the experts who can do it.
Yeah, it seems like a great strategy, because I imagine he sat through so many interviews where they sort of say the same exact thing, and then suddenly your last person is really memorable because they say a lot of things that you don't expect. So sounds like a great strategy.
And then the final differentiator that really make the Starretts stand out is how their fee is structured. So I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent here to talk about fixed fee versus cost plus contracts, because this is really important in construction, but also applies to a lot of industries. When you're thinking about how a contract is structured, that's what's going to drive the incentives for both parties. So remember, Raskob and Smith are going to have a contract with the Starrett brothers to build the Empire State Building. And so we want to make sure that the incentives are aligned for Smith and Raskob to be happy, but then also for the Starrett brothers, the contractors, to be happy. So what most contractors at the time did, and in a lot of cases still today, is they use what's called a cost plus contract. So basically, the owners, Raskob and Smith, are billed for the cost of the labor and materials at whatever market price that is, and then they also pay out a fixed fee for the contractor. So let's say it takes $40 million to build the Empire State Building. The contractor would say, okay, my price is $40 million plus my $1 million fee. And that's set in stone. None of that changes. So this is good for the contractor because it removes risk. Like if the building ends up taking longer, if material prices go up, if labor is more expensive than they expected, that's all absorbed by the owner. But this is not good for the owner because their cost is kind of uncapped and they have to cover any overages. And it also doesn't incentivize cost and time savings for the contractor. So they don't care if the project takes longer or goes over budget because
they're getting paid no matter what.
They're getting paid no matter what. It's going to be the owner who's on the hook for these overages. So then the other contract structure, and this is what the Sterretts propose, is the fixed fee contract. And so that's where the builder is paid a fixed fee for the entire project, including cost and profit. So that's basically, they say it's going to cost us $41 million to build the entire state building, everything included. And so in this case, the contractor or the builder has to assume the risk for any schedule delays, material increases, labor increases. But any savings they have on that fixed fee, the contractor can keep.
It's just pure profit for them.
Yeah, so you can see how they'd be incentivized because, in the first structure, maybe they were going to get this $1 million fee and they make $1 million regardless. So they don't care if the project finishes a year or 2 years. But if you have this fixed fee structure, they're getting paid $41 million no matter what. So if they can save on labor and materials, their profit could be more than $1 million. So again, the key thing here is the incentives are aligned in this fixed fee contract for the contractors to try to go faster and save money.
So it seems fixed fee is the way to go for both parties, assuming your general contractor is competent. So why would you ever want to do cost plus?
Yeah, so there's a key thing you said there, assuming your general contractor is competent. And competence maybe not even the right word because these are really difficult projects. So you got to imagine if I come to you and I say, I'll build the Empire State Building for you for $45 million. I'm taking on a lot of risk, and I have to be able to estimate the cost very well. And so you have to have a lot of construction experience, and in this case, experience building skyscrapers to be able to say, I'm really confident that I can do it for $45 million. Because if I'm wrong and it costs $50 million, not only am I not getting paid, I'm actually losing money because I still have to pay the $50 million.
Yeah, this is very interesting. It sounds like as a building manager, you need to think really hard about who you give your contract to.
Yeah, and again, the key is that the incentives are aligned because you want the general contractors, you want everyone pulling in the same direction, basically. And that's the beauty in this case of the fixed fee contract because Smith and Raskob know exactly what they're going to pay up front. And then the Sterrett brothers, any time or labor savings, and they expect there to be some because they're really good at their jobs, that's additional profit for them.
So Smith and Raskob interview the Sterrett brothers. What do they end up doing?
Smith is really impressed with their answers. They're very experienced, and so almost immediately they hire them on to construct the Empire State Building.
Okay, so how long does this interview process end up taking?
So Smith and Raskob hire on the Sterrett brothers in September of 1929, and that's just 1 month after they announced the company and a couple weeks after they brought the architects on board. So all this is happening in a really short time frame, and that's especially important because they're optimizing around speed. And so it's imperative that the architects have the builders' input on how are we going to design this building to be constructed as fast as possible.
Yeah, I could see how input from the builders has a major impact on construction speed.
Yes, and it's also going to figure into one of the Sterrett strategies for how they meet this May 1st deadline. There's 3 strategies they come up with to meet this deadline. The first is the project delivery method that they choose. Second, their organizational structure. And then third, how they optimize for speed. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the project delivery method. This, again, is really important in modern-day construction and really any kind of project. But there's several different ways you can manage how the design and construction are sequenced. So kind of the base case or the obvious case is what in the construction industry we call design, bid, build. And that means you have a designer complete the entire design for the project. It reaches 100% design. And then you bid it out to a general contractor, and then they build it. And so it's purely sequential activities. What the Sterretts choose to do in this case, and they don't call it this at the time, but it's what's known today as design build or fast-tracked construction. And that basically means they're going to start construction before the design is 100% complete. And so this is going to be very important for the tight timeline that they have, because it's going to allow them to pull construction in and start earlier than they would otherwise if they had to wait for the entire design to be completed.
What are the downsides to fast-tracked construction?
Yeah, so this is challenging in some cases, though, because it's basically this idea of, you've heard before, like building a plane while you're flying it. Like they're building a building while they're designing it. So it requires really careful planning and coordination between everyone involved, especially the designers and builders, because any mistakes that are made in construction are really hard to correct. And so just to give you an idea of how design and construction are going to be sandwiched right up against each other, the steel design, so like the layout for what sizes steel we need, what length of beams do we need to have, that was completed in a lot of cases less than 1 month before the orders went to the steel mill to create the steel beams. And then the steel was delivered from the mill to the building site less than 1 week before it was due for erection. So to me, this is almost like a pseudo just-in-time delivery method too, where they basically work backwards from when they need the steel on site, and they compress the schedule as much as they can. The second strategy that the Starretts have for meeting this tight deadline is that they're going to run this general contractor company like a military organization. And this obviously harkens back to Colonel Starrett's time in the military. And basically, he organizes the general contractor kind of like a general staff. And so there's going to be about 80 plus people working for the Starrett brothers, managing the overall construction. And that's going to include the superintendent, who is kind of like the field marshal, or, leading the on-site construction. You're going to have job runners. You're going to have someone managing the construction department. You're going to have accounting. You're going to have a department that manages cost, material deliveries. They also have an on-site doctor and nurse, and this entire admin administration to basically manage what's going to be about 3,400 different people on site at once. And so with about 3,400 workers on site during peak construction, the Starretts are really managing the logistics of a large army. And it's funny because there are all these kind of emergent problems when you're working with this many people. It really is like a small army. So payroll, for example, is so large that it has to be delivered by armed guards because they're paying them in cash at this time. There's no wire transfer. The meals was a big question because so you have 3,400 people working in this one building. If they all have to leave the building, go down the elevators for lunch every day, it's going to waste a ton of time. So the Starretts actually end up building about 5 temporary restaurants within the building at floors at various levels so that the workers don't need to leave site to eat lunch. And the final strategy that the Starretts have to meet the May 1st deadline is this extreme kind of pathological focus on speed. And they do a few things to optimize the speed of construction. The first is, as much as possible, they execute the construction as a repeatable process. At this time, assembly lines are being used to manufacture automobiles, and so they try to take as many learnings as they can to make construction repeatable and flow in this assembly line type process. The next innovation that they have is what they call the 4 pacemakers. And this is really interesting because this is basically a precursor to critical path project planning. So managing projects nowadays, you always want to know what your critical path is. And that's basically what's the longest activity that is driving all the other tasks. This makes a lot of sense from a practical standpoint because you imagine you have 3,400 people on site doing hundreds of activities. How are you going to know which one's the most important, which one's gating other projects? And so the Starretts basically collapse all of these tasks into the 4 most important. And those are structural steel erection, concrete floors, the exterior metal trim and spandrels, and the exterior limestone. So now they only have to manage 4 different tasks, and they realize that as long as these 4 pacemakers are on track, everything else on the project is going to be on track. And then, most importantly for the execution side, is they're going to optimize down to the T the logistics of transporting materials to site and within the site. to avoid work stoppage. And this goes back to they view construction basically as a material transport problem. And so fundamentally, what's going to drive the speed of construction is how can they move men and materials to and within the site as optimally as possible. So the Starretts have a plan for meeting this ambitious May 1st deadline. Now they're going to need to put all of their energy into executing it. Just to jump ahead a little bit here real quick, the Starretts, I mentioned they're really passionate and prideful about their job. They end up putting so much passion and effort into the Empire State Building that it probably kills both of them afterwards. 1 year after the building was finished, Colonel William Starrett suffered a stroke and he died at the age of 55. And that was blamed mostly on job-related stress.
No kidding. Wow.
And then Paul Starrett, he wrote this really interesting autobiography after he retired. And he says, quote, "After 40 years of intense activity, the strain of erecting the Empire State Building in 11 months was too much for me, and I suffered a rather severe nervous breakdown." And so he retired shortly after the Empire State Building was complete. And this, as they expected, ended up being the crowning achievement of their careers.
So to summarize, Smith and Raskob are setting out to build the world's tallest building, which is this very complex project with a very tight deadline. Picking the builder here is absolutely critical, and they end up going with this general contractor named Starrett Brothers and Eakin. Starrett Brothers and Eakin are known for not only having built 40th Wall Street, but also they are experts at building skyscrapers, and they're known to move fast. So it seems like a good idea, but we'll have to see how they execute. The Starretts come up with three main strategies to meet this aggressive May 1st deadline. The strategies are the design-build execution method. They also want to run the construction site like a military operation, and they're obsessed with speed.
Exactly. And a couple important things to remember from what we've talked about. First, the Starretts are very experienced in skyscraper construction, but this is going to be the biggest project they've ever taken on. The Empire State's going to be the tallest building, but it's also much larger than any other skyscraper. Second, the Starretts are going to optimize their logistics like they're supplying an army, and this is going to be paramount for the rapid speed of construction. So it's one thing to give a nice pitch and put together some impressive ideas on strategy to meet this aggressive timeline, but now we're going to see if they can actually make it happen. So we mentioned how important logistics are going to be for completing the Empire State Building on time. And to give you an idea of how the Starrett brothers are going to view the importance of logistics on this project, I want to share a quote from Colonel William Starrett. And remember, he's the one who compared constructing a skyscraper to war. "The leader must lead and inspire the thousands of men whose united labor results in a mighty structure. He must control his source of supply, and he must see that his supply trains keep pace with his need for them." So you can see here that Colonel Starrett's attitude is he's going to war. And instead of fighting in the trenches, he's going to be fighting in Midtown Manhattan. And his enemy is going to be time. And we know how important in war logistics is. And it's going to be just the same for this example. And this actually reminds me of one time I was working on a construction project. And this superintendent told me, basically, he's like, you'll be surprised how fast the workers can move when they have everything they need. There's this stereotype of you see a construction site and there's like one guy shoveling dirt and three guys watching, or you see people standing around a construction site and they're not doing anything. A lot of people assume that the workers are being lazy or they're just not getting anything done. But really, in most cases, they don't have the materials or they're not unblocked to complete their work. And so the key thing to ensuring progress in the construction site is making sure all the materials are there so that if the workers have a clear road in front of them, they'll just bang out progress if there's nothing stopping them. Again, this is important. How the Starretts see this problem is it's a material delivery problem. How can they get all the raw materials to site as quickly as possible to keep the workers moving and accomplish this aggressive deadline?
It seems to me like logistics is the critical path here.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to break down the logistics into two categories. The first is going to be how they transport materials to site, and then how they move materials around once they're already on site. So getting the materials to site is important because the deliveries have to follow this really precise schedule to keep pace with construction. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the materials that the Sterretts need to bring to this site in Midtown Manhattan, there's a quote from a newspaper at the time that said, "If all the materials which came to the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street for the construction of the Empire State had come in one shipment, a train 57 miles in length would have been needed. When the locomotive of such a train would have entered New York, the caboose on the rear end would have come to a halt in Bridgeport, Connecticut."
That's amazing. So it's simply impractical to stockpile everything up front. You have to have this precise delivery schedule.
And these materials are delivered from all over the world. So they bring in limestone from Indiana, steel beams from Pittsburgh, cement from upstate New York, marble from Italy, Germany, and England, wood from the Pacific Coast forest. And Smith and Raskob are also ruthless about securing these supply lines. So there's an example where one of the marble quarries in France informs them that they're not going to be able to keep up with the pace of construction because they have commitments to other customers that they have to honor. And so Raskob and Smith don't waste any time. They cancel that order and then outright buy a marble quarry in Germany to ensure that there aren't any delivery issues.
So Smith and Raskob are clearly deeply involved in this process then, if they are going as far as buying a quarry.
Yes. And what this shows me is that Raskob especially understands the trade-off between time and money. So at first glance, it might seem really wasteful to spend a ton of money on a marble quarry just for this project. But Raskob has done the calculation and he realizes that if this saves us time on construction, it's actually going to be more efficient because we can sell the quarry afterwards. And, any time that we save in schedule is also money because they have that May 1st deadline and that 6 months of rents hang in the balance. So of all these material deliveries, the steel was the most important because if erection of the steel structure was delayed by even 1 day, the other trades are going to be forced to slow down. So the steel skeleton is the critical path here. Now, just to give an example of the complex journey that the different raw materials had to take to get to site, I want to follow the journey of a single steel beam from the raw materials to site where it's eventually added to the structure. So this journey would start with iron mined in Minnesota, loaded onto rail cars, then transferred by barge 1,000 miles across the Great Lakes to the steel mills in Pennsylvania. And for the Empire State Building, these steel plants ran 24 hours a day in 2 12-hour shifts. And they would take the iron, they would mix it with coke and other ingredients, heat it up to 3,500 degrees, and then purify the ore of the excess carbon before they rolled it into the correct structural shape needed for the design of the Empire State Building. The resulting beam was then cooled, rivet holes were punched in it, and then it was placed on a rail car for a 400-mile trip from Pittsburgh to a supply yard in New Jersey. Once in New Jersey, it was marked with a code to identify its place in the complex framework, and then it was barged across the river to Manhattan, then loaded on a truck and transported to site where these derricks, or you can think of them as cranes, would lift the steel beam off the truck and relay it up to the correct floor to be swung into position on the structure. So once the steel was riveted into place, it had made the journey from the Pittsburgh furnaces to site in sometimes as little as 80 hours. And that's a testament to the efficiency of the supply chain, and the joke with the workers was that the iron was still warm to the touch by the time they were installing it.
Wow. Yeah, and I think that's also literally true because my understanding is that steel mills at the time would put red-hot steel beams on the rail cars and ship them off.
Yeah, it all speaks to the importance of speed here. And the Empire State Building required 57,000 tons of structural steel. So to put that in perspective, that's almost enough steel to build 9 Eiffel Towers. So we've talked about how complex and important the supply chains are. And one of the key actions the Starretts take to manage the flow of materials to site is they use this system of expediters. And this is basically an individual who would manage all the details for every piece of a material's journey to site. So you might have a steel expediter, and they would go to the iron mines in Minnesota and make sure that the iron deliveries happened on time to the steel mills. Then they would go to the steel mill and make sure that the steel deliveries are getting put on the rail cars on schedule. And in some cases, they would even ride the trains with the materials to make sure that there weren't any delays along the way. And so to me, this is an example of, you got to think about the time period. This is before video conferencing or even really phone calls were available. So to make sure that your materials were on track, you couldn't just pick up the phone and ask if that material shipped out. You needed to have someone on site to verify with their eyes that the steel beams have left the rail yard or whatever. But it's also, I think, something that can be effective today in terms of, you got to imagine if you're a supplier and you have a customer and they need their order, but they're just this construction project that's happening way off in New York and you're in Pittsburgh and you don't really talk to them except for over the phone, you're probably not super incentivized to meet their orders. But if you have one of them in your factory who's saying like, hey, my steel beams were supposed to ship out at 9 o'clock this morning and now it's 10 o'clock, what's going on? Like, you have somebody there like yelling in your face. It's I imagine a forceful means of persuasion. So there's a lot that goes into getting the materials to site, but then there's a second half of the supply chain, which is transporting materials once they arrive on site. And for this, the overall strategy the Starretts are going to use is like an assembly line. So the goal here is to minimize the number of times each material is handled. So to do this, they prefabricate materials as much as possible, and the goal is to do as little work on site as possible. For example, the windows, steel mullions, the stone, these are all standardized, like parts in a catalog, and they're manufactured off-site in large quantities in an efficient factory and then shipped to site.
I imagine that helps with cost as well. When you build windows off-site in a factory setting and so on, you get some economies of scale, and just the assembly process must be more cost-effective than doing it on-site.
Yeah, and remember, this ties directly back into the design and the idea to go with this less decorative Art Deco style, so that as part of the style, you do have a bunch of repeating windows. You don't have a lot of unique ornamentation. So a direct benefit from the design decisions they made. So the next area the Starretts are going to optimize is how deliveries are received and unloaded on site. So they do something a bit unique here, driven by some of the site constraints of working in Midtown Manhattan. They don't have anywhere to store materials or a laydown yard or anything like that. So they decide that they will unload deliveries inside the building. So the trucks actually drive up inside the building, they unload on the first floor, and then they use cranes to lift the materials up through the elevator shafts to the floor. So this has a couple of benefits. The first is they don't block any traffic on site. And then second, all the materials are lifted within the core of the building, so they're not hanging out over the streets and endangering pedestrians or anything like that. And so, as you can imagine, for a building as large as the Empire State Building, there's going to be a lot of deliveries. And at peak construction, they averaged 500 trucks a day unloading inside the building, which for an 8-hour workday is about 1 truck every minute. And just to emphasize how important this process was, there's a quote from Eakin, who worked with the Starrett brothers. He says, "We ran trucks the way they run trains in and out of Grand Central. If a truck missed its place in line on Tuesday, it had to wait until Wednesday to get back in." So this is a precise military operation here on how these trucks deliver materials to site, because there's no room for error. When they're unloading 1 truck every minute, it's almost like an assembly line depositing materials on the construction site.
Yeah, and I think space is very valuable here, right? Because you're in Manhattan. It's not like you have a huge yard where trucks can just kind of hang out. You got to get them in, unload, and get it out.
Yeah, and that's where this idea of kind of like pseudo just-in-time delivery comes in, because maybe prior you would just stockpile all the materials, but you need to have as little time between material delivery and installation as possible. So once these materials were unloaded from trucks on the first floor and lifted up to whichever floor they were needed at, the Starretts had another innovation unique to the Empire State Building at the time. And they built a narrow gauge railroad on each floor, and they added in these push carts to transport materials from where the cranes dropped them off at to whichever part of the floor where they needed to be included. This worked well on the Empire State Building because, we mentioned earlier, the site was so large. So on a typical skyscraper at the time, this wouldn't really have made sense because there wasn't much distance from the interior of the building to the edges. But the Empire State, it was a huge site, so it was a huge efficiency improvement to, rather than workers carrying the materials, the bricks, the stone by hand from the floor to where it needed to be installed, they had these push carts and this pretty complicated railway system with like switches and everything. It was really well thought through. Another really impressive innovation the Starretts make is how they deliver bricks to site. So I mentioned earlier, their whole strategy for optimizing the material deliveries is they want to handle each material as few times as possible. And for the bricks, they really hit it out of the park. You could imagine that the optimal way to deliver a material to site is by handling it only once. Anything beyond that is excess and wasteful. And so for the bricks, they devised this system where a truck pulls up on the first floor, dumps the bricks into this hopper in the basement floor, and it automatically lifts the bricks up through the elevator shafts to whichever floor they need them on. Then they're unloaded into the rail carts on this rail system, and they are taken to whichever part of the building they're needed at. So the only time a human hand touches a brick is when a builder picks it up to put it into place. So construction starts with the demolition of the existing Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and most of the debris is hauled off-site, and they actually dump it in the Atlantic Ocean because they don't have anywhere else to put it.
I'm guessing that wouldn't be legal today.
Probably not. Probably violates some sort of environmental codes. So similar to 40 Wall Street, the Starrett brothers start digging the foundations even while the demolition of the Waldorf Astoria is still in progress. And this, again, is a time-saving mechanism because they can overlap activities a little bit here. They dig down and reach that solid Manhattan schist at only 38 feet below the surface, which is very shallow compared to other sites. And they end up hauling about 28,000 truckloads of hotel debris, earth, and rock off-site. Once the foundations are in place, they start the critical activity, which is the structural steel erection. The steel is brought to site from trucks, it's lifted off and hoisted to the correct floor, where it's riveted into place. The steel erection is the most important of the four pacemakers, and the Starretts achieve some really impressive records for the speed of erection here. They average 4.5 stories per week.
Wow, that's insanely fast. That's like almost 20 stories in a month.
Yeah, and for one 10-day period, they averaged 1.4 stories per day, which was a record then and even today is still incredibly fast for steel erection. And once they complete the steel erection, they celebrate what's traditionally called the topping out of the steel structure by raising an American flag. And this marks the completion of the structural steel. So close behind the steel erection, they're also building the walls and floors.
So I'm imagining this steel structure going up and then sort of lagging behind. You have these walls being built sort of in parallel, but not on the same day as the steel structure is going up.
Yeah, they're basically hanging the walls off the side of the steel structure. And that's why the structural steel was the most important pacemaker.
I'm seeing a lot of parallelization here.
Yes, absolutely. And the wall construction also benefits from that railroad and brick delivery system I mentioned earlier. Then, once the walls for each floor are complete, close on their heels, they're followed by what's called the fit-out. And this is basically where all the interior trades come through to complete their work. So we have the electricians putting in the electrical system, the plumbers come through and install all the pipes, the telephone wires are installed, the elevators, everything that you need the building to be dried in or enclosed for.
And is the fitting out happening in parallel with the steel beam going up on higher floors?
Yes. So you can kind of think of it as an assembly line, because once the steel is in place, the walls can be installed. Once the walls are installed, they can do fit out, but they're proceeding upwards with the structural steel, and the base of the tower is following close behind.
So we've talked about a ton of optimizations in building the Empire State Building, starting with logistics all the way up to the construction site itself. But I'm really curious, Will, what was it like to be on the construction site as an average worker? Who were those people? Like, what was the average day like?
Yeah, so there's some fascinating stories from the workers who built the Empire State. And there were over 60 different types of trades on the site. We mentioned that construction had become really specialized. So on this project, you have plumbers, electricians, elevator technicians, painters. My favorite is probably the water boys, who basically brought water to the workers as they worked. But in a lot of cases, they were as young as 14 or 15 years old, working on this dangerous construction site. In some ways, they kind of remind me of like the drummer boys from the Civil War, when you had these really young, like teenage boys who were in these very dangerous situations. Probably the most specialized trade on site was the iron workers. And I like to think of them as kind of the special forces of construction, because they have this really dangerous, really specialized job that almost takes a certain mindset to do. They're known as the Sky Boys for walking across these steel beams hundreds of feet in the air with no harness or safety system at all. You've probably seen this famous picture of workers sitting on a steel beam eating lunch hundreds of feet up into the air over New York.
Is there a reason why they didn't use harnesses at the time? Was safety just not a culturally important thing at the time?
So there's a few reasons they didn't use harnesses at this point in history. The first and most obvious is the safety standards weren't that complex. You know, OSHA, or the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, didn't exist yet, so there weren't any rules governing workplace safety. Secondly, it was partially a speed thing. So if you're tied off onto a building and you have this harness, you're going to work a lot more slowly than if you can just move around more nimbly. And so that was part of the trade-off, is it would have been a lot slower to include the safety harnesses.
Yeah, attaching and detaching the harness takes time and so on.
And not only that, but also the steel beams have to have tie-off points for harnesses. So it's not like they just put on the harnesses. Like, you have to have a system of infrastructure in place to support the harnesses.
Right, it's all time and complexity that adds cost.
Yeah, but then what's most interesting to me, too, is the workers themselves didn't want to wear harnesses, because these iron workers were a different breed of men. They were very proud of their fearlessness and ability to work at heights, and so they almost wore it as a badge of honor.
Oh, wow. So it was a sense of pride.
Yeah. There was a photographer named Lewis Hine that was hired to document the progress of construction, and he took these series of iconic photographs of the iron workers that, you know, are just really epic and heroic. There's one of a guy, and he is riding the hook on a crane, and he's wearing nothing but shorts and boots, and he's being lifted up hundreds of feet into the air. And then all these other pictures of, you know, workers dangling out on steel beams with the impressive Manhattan skyline in the background. And so they're really romanticized at the time, and they take a lot of pride in their work. And they were also paid significantly more than other workers on the site because of the risks they did take.
Well, I'm glad that this culture has since changed, and it appears to me, at least today, that we have a more safety-first oriented culture.
Yeah, and interestingly, this attracted a specific type of worker. So a lot of the iron workers were from Newfoundland, where they were descended from sailors and other people who were experienced working high up. But then also there's this group of Mohawk Indians that were famous for having a culture of fearlessness and working at heights from a young age.
So this all seems incredibly dangerous. Were there any accidents?
Yeah, so to kind of set the background, construction during this period was very dangerous, and the national death rate for the construction industry was second only to the mining industry.
Wow.
So, like we said, there weren't any safety guidelines or OSHA or anything like that during this time period. Interestingly, the ironworkers actually faced really high life insurance premiums. And I found some stats on this. One life insurance company that served ironworkers specifically, they recorded 2,000 deaths out of 15,000 policies in a 20-year period. So that's like a 13% mortality rate for ironworkers.
Holy smokes.
So tragically, 5 workers ended up losing their lives during the construction of the Empire State Building. For the time period, the Empire State Building was actually safer than most other construction sites. They did a lot of improvements to promote safety, like installing protective netting, adding a fire alarm system. They had a full doctor and nurse on site.
Yeah, but I assume that this pales in comparison to modern safety standards.
Absolutely. So they were a bit ahead of the curve for the time period, but nothing like the safety requirements we have today with harnesses and personal protective equipment and that sort of thing.
So were most of these falling accidents?
So all 5 deaths were isolated incidents, the kind of accidents you might expect on a large construction site with 3,400 people all doing something different. So in one case, a worker tragically got hit by a truck. There was another incident where a worker fell down an elevator shaft.
So no common pattern here, just a few isolated incidents.
So we talked about some of the difficult jobs and the extreme risk these workers took building the Empire State Building. But one thing that was clear to me in a lot of the research, and there's some really good interviews with some of the people who worked on the Empire State that we'll link in the show notes, but all the workers on this project, they realized that they were building something special, and they believed that they were building a monument, and they had a special pride in their work. So there's one quote from an ironworker where he's explaining, why he works on these beams hundreds of feet in the air every day. And he says, "You get to love it and you can't quit it. Life down on the street's too slow. Who wants to be a pencil pusher after he's worked with steel? It's nice to point to a mighty suspension bridge or towering building and say, I helped erect that." To honor all the workers who were involved in the construction of the Empire State Building, in the lobby, even to this day, they installed these bronze medallions to honor each craft. So there's like one for electrical, masonry, heating, all the major crafts that participate in the building. And these are in the lobby right when you walk in as a testament to the work of the men who built it.
So you could see this as a tourist. If I walked in today, I could see this.
Yeah, you can see it today. So ultimately, everything comes together. The obsession with logistics, both on transporting materials to site and within the site, the focus on the 4 pacemakers, the incredible stories of the individual workers who built the Empire State Building, it all comes together, and in late April of 1931, the building finishes on time and under budget, which is something you can't say for many projects, period, especially today. Just to give you an idea of how quickly this construction occurred, the demolition work took about 3 months for the Waldorf Astoria, and then from the time they started excavation to opening day was only 13 and a half months. All 4 pacemakers that the Sterretts were tracking finished early, and critically, the steel erection averaged 4.5 floors per week and finished several days early. So the building was completed in early April, just in time for the critical May 1st deadline.
So Smith and Raskob take all these scheduling risks, and it works out great.
Yeah, they're even able to finish early.
And you also said that they came in under budget.
Yeah, so interestingly, the initial estimate for construction was $43 million. That actually got revised down to $27 million because of the depression price decreases, which we'll get to later. But the final cost of the building was $25 million, which was about $2 million under budget. And again, this was savings on the Sterretts side, so they got to pocket that as additional profit.
Yeah, just pure profit.
And most interesting to me about finishing on time and under budget is they also did this doing construction mostly in 8-hour days, 5 days a week. The only real overtime and weekend work they did was hauling debris offsite during demo. And so initially, my thoughts would have been, okay, they finished early. They probably did a lot of weekend work. They were probably working maybe even around the clock. But in most cases, they were working a regular 8-hour, 5-day-a-week schedule.
So why was it 8 hours a day? It seems like they could have theoretically gone over twice or 3 times as fast with a second or third shift. Was this for ordnance reasons? Was it an issue with daylight?
So I believe the biggest driver of the working hours was that most of the workers on the site, especially for some of these specialized trades, were union workers. And Al Smith was really friendly with the unions, and so he wasn't going to go against their typical working hours.
Because I would have expected, given the speed, that there would be like 2 12-hour shifts and they worked around the clock on this thing. So that's very surprising to hear that it was 8-hour day, 5-day weeks, and they still got it done in record time.
So when construction finally finished, it's celebrated by Al Smith, who shoots the last rivet for the 102nd story observation deck. But this is not just any rivet. This is supposedly a solid golden rivet, kind of like the golden railway spike to complete the Transcontinental Railroad.
So we've talked about the incredible importance of logistics of moving materials both to the site and around the site and the various optimizations that were made. We also talked about the overview of the construction process and the nature of the dangerous and difficult work involved in construction at the time. Ultimately, the building was completed in early April of 1931, which was a little bit ahead of schedule for the May 1st opening deadline. Now, Will, I noticed that this was done in about 13 months, but there wasn't a lot of story here in the actual construction of it. Why?
Yeah, so the actual construction kind of goes off without a hitch, and it's maybe a bit uneventful, but in a good way, because all this planning and optimization the Sterretts put together to make sure construction is optimized down to a T, it works really well. So a few important things to remember here. One, the Sterretts approached the construction like a war, and they organized their company like an army to meet this complex challenge. The Sterretts also executed the construction as much as possible as a repeatable process, like an assembly line. And they had these innovations like the railroad and standardized parts for the windows to help them achieve this goal. And finally, what stands out is the Sterretts' intense focus on logistics. They prioritized material transportation both to and around the site to prevent any work stoppage. And they used several different innovations like the expediters and their organization of the truck deliveries. So now, Smith and Raskob have met their ambitious goal to build the tallest building in the world by the May 1st deadline, with the help of the architects, the builders, and the workers on site. But there was something that happened back in October of 1929 that Smith and Raskob couldn't have predicted. On May 1st, 1931, Al Smith finally opens the newly constructed Empire State Building to celebration and fanfare. Smith's public relations machine is in overdrive for opening day to make it a massive event and attract lots of attention. So the press actually refers to the Empire State Building initially as Al Smith's building, just because he has become so associated with its construction.
Yeah, he's like the face of the building.
Absolutely. And so him and his grandchildren cut a ribbon at the Fifth Avenue entrance to formally open the building. That day, Smith hosted the press, celebrities, and several dignitaries at a banquet on the 86th floor observatory. There was a ceremony where President Hoover in Washington, D.C. flipped a switch to turn on the lights to the Empire State Building. But interestingly, Raskob, he was happy to let Al Smith be the face of the building. He wasn't present for the opening day ceremonies. He was actually on a ship on his way to Italy for vacation.
Is there a reason for this?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting window into Raskob's attitude. So, from the public perspective, it seems like, oh, this is the celebration of the building opening. But really, to Raskob, this is just another part of the business. And opening day is not really a celebration. It's to try and drum up as much attention for the building as possible. And that's Al Smith's job. So Raskov's like, I'm done. I'm going on vacation. Al Smith, open the building, get us a lot of attention, rent out the space, and let's start making money.
Yeah.
And so this building that started out just as an idea for Smith and Raskob after their failed presidential run has succeeded in becoming the world's tallest building, despite the intense competition from the Chrysler Building, 40 Wall Street, not to mention the challenges of constructing this 2.1 million square foot building in Manhattan, and they met this really aggressive May 1st deadline. So the construction of the building had been a success, but there's one issue overshadowing the entire project on opening day.
I think I know what it is.
And that was the beginnings of the Great Depression. The stock market had crashed famously in October 1929, and at this point, we're almost 2 years deep into a depression that's getting worse and worse. Manhattan real estate had been overbuilt during that boom of the 20s that we talked about at the top of the episode, and now there's a glut of office space on the market. It's not a great time to be opening the largest office building in the world. And new construction in New York City had actually dropped 50% from the stock market crash.
50%. So how many occupants does the Empire State Building initially have?
Yeah, so it opens to a lot of fanfare and celebration, but a few months after opening day, it's only about 20% occupied, which is short of the initial 50% goal. And so the story of the Empire State for its first few years is a little anticlimactic and kind of sad in a lot of ways because it's during the Depression. This economic boom time that inspired its construction has come and gone. And so it's actually called the Empty State Building because there's only 20% of the floors occupied. There's actually no tenants from the 41st floor and up, so they suspend the elevator service because these floors are just empty. But Raskob and Smith continue to operate the building. It's not a good time to sell, but their intention was always to operate the building. Al Smith remained as president of the Empire State Building Company, and he earned a salary of $50,000 a year. And he's really responsible for the one highlight of the Empire State Building during this time, which is it's a popular tourist attraction. So even though the office space is not really rented out, the observatories for the tallest building in the world are still really popular. They average about 2,200 visitors a day, and in the first year, gross about $875,000.
So that's what, like 2% of the cost of the building?
Yeah, so they are making some money, even if they're not renting out all the space. And the revenue from the observatories helped the building weather the Depression. What's interesting to me is being the tallest building in the world really did have a significant economic impact because some of these other buildings, like 40 Wall Street, for example, it wasn't doing well during the Depression because all the office space was underpriced, but also they couldn't claim the moniker of world's tallest building, so there weren't any observation deck revenues either. So to me, this really hits home Raskob's idea that even if the economic analysis said that they shouldn't build beyond 63 stories, there was this huge intangible benefit to having the world's tallest building. So during this time, Al Smith is still the face of the Empire State Building. He continues to promote it to attract tenants. He hosts a lot of VIPs like Amelia Earhart, the 1936 Olympic team, and then eventually the Queen of England comes to visit the Empire State Building. But then Smith slowly begins to withdraw from the public eye. He would never again hold political office after the failed presidential bid, and he actually ended up walking away from the Democratic Party.
And what about Raskob?
So Raskob had actually divested most of his stock holdings before the crash, so he was able to survive it from an economic standpoint without too many issues, but the Depression did hit him personally. One of his close friends who led a bank that failed, he ended up committing suicide during the Depression. And it really hit Raskob personally and just shows some of the tragedy that occurred during these tough economic times. And during this time, the Empire State Building was struggling to meet its mortgage payments because even with the tenants and some of the observation deck revenues, it wasn't enough to pay the money they had financed to construct it. And so on several instances, Raskob paid millions of dollars out of his own pocket to keep the building afloat. Later in life, Raskob left most of his fortune to a Catholic charity that he founded, and then in his will, he left the building to his children, who eventually went on to sell it after his death.
What I'm also really curious about is, did anything ever come of the mooring mast?
Yeah, so the mooring mast, there were several attempts made to dock a dirigible, but none were ever really successful due to the high-speed winds that are created in the canyons of these Manhattan skyscrapers. From the beginning, it was kind of a crazy idea that you could dock an airship at the top of a building. It proves unsuccessful, and then eventually, after the Hindenburg disaster, airships fall out of fashion. It's never actually used as a mooring mast, and it was turned into the 101st and 102nd floor observatories.
Yeah, wow. So we have the Great Depression, we have low occupancy, and we have this mooring mast that never actually gets any use. So really, they're just initially getting revenue from the observatory. But 100 years later, the Empire State Building is alive and well. So what ends up happening to it to make it a success?
The story of the Empire State Building up to modern day is really a story of it becoming more than just a tall office building and becoming a symbol. Even during the Depression, Al Smith hires Belle Moskowitz to promote the building. Belle Moskowitz was actually Smith's campaign manager throughout his entire political career, and she was a key reason for his political and public relations success.
Yeah, it seems like a good fit. If you can promote a political campaign, you can maybe promote a building too.
Yeah, so he hired her to promote the building and try to stir up some interest in tenants. And it was actually Belle Moskowitz who hired Louis Hine to take those iconic photographs of the workers during construction. Those photos immediately became iconic and helped tell the building's story. She also had several really ingenious advertising campaigns that she ran. This pencil company ran an ad with the tagline, "The world's tallest building was started with a pencil." Back to the idea that Raskob initially came up with the idea by holding up a pencil. There was a cigarette company that ran an ad with the tagline, "Camel's tobaccos are soothing to the nerves," and it showed a picture of a window cleaner cleaning the windows on the 101st story. And really, for average Americans, the Empire State Building becomes ubiquitous because it's a big deal in New York, but around the country, it's also on the advertising. When you're buying your cigarettes or buying your pencils, you're also seeing advertisements for the Empire State Building. Also, in 1933, the original King Kong movie comes out, and everyone's probably familiar, even today, with this iconic scene of Kong hanging from the mooring mast of the Empire State Building. And this really cemented the building as the tallest building in the world in the minds of people across the globe. And eventually, the Empire State Building became more than just the world's tallest building, more than just an office building. It became an icon of New York City, and then also a symbol of what America could achieve.
So bring us to the present day. What is the Empire State Building like today?
So today, the Empire State Building has become a symbol of New York, and its unique Art Deco style is also a symbol of the spirit of the Roaring Twenties when it was constructed. In 1948, it finally became profitable after struggling to find tenants for almost 20 years. But then by the 50s, net annual profits were about $5 million, which made it one of the most profitable buildings in the world. But then, as we know, the Empire State Building wouldn't be the tallest in the world forever. In 1973, it lost the height crown to the newly completed World Trade Center Towers, also in New York City.
But 1973, that's over 40 years after opening day, so it had a good run.
Yeah, it actually had one of the longest modern-day runs as the tallest building in the world, because after the World Trade Center Towers were built in 1973, shortly thereafter the Sears Tower was built, then the Petronas Towers, up to present day the Burj Khalifa is the world's tallest building. But each of these have been outdone and only held their height crown for 10 years of less.
So to summarize, the Empire State Building opens in 1931, but it struggles a lot initially because of the Great Depression. It opens to 20% occupancy. Raskob and Smith do continue to own and operate the building after opening, but it takes until the 1950s for the building to finally become profitable. But ultimately, the Empire State Building becomes a cultural modern-day landmark.
And a few important ideas to remember here. Any building that's 90 plus years old has had to continue to reinvent itself to stay relevant, especially somewhere like Manhattan, where land values are so high that there's always constant pressure to make space for something new. But the Empire State Building has survived by continuously reinventing itself from being just a tall office building to a uniquely American landmark. And it's survived today as a symbol of the practical, optimistic, and heroic spirit of the men who built it.
What a story. I mean, it really raises a bunch of interesting questions like, how did they complete this on time and under budget? Like, why can't we do this today? I mean, there's so many questions here.
Yeah, I agree. So let's get into some analysis. So first I want to start with a few interesting ideas from the story that stuck out to me as I was doing the research for the Empire State Building. And what stuck out to me the most when I first started learning about the story of the Empire State Building was how was it completed on time and under budget? So to break this down, there's two areas. There's the budget, finishing under budget, and then there's finishing ahead of schedule. And the two are both intertwined, but specifically for the budget, there's one kind of caveat I want to add here, and that is a lot of the reason the project was under budget was because of the Depression. So labor was not an issue because many people were out of work, so they were able to hire a lot of people at below estimated salaries. And then also prices had collapsed. As the economy was collapsing, they were able to buy their materials much cheaper. So I think we talked about how the original budget for construction was about $43 million. That was revised down to $27 million when the Depression prices came down. But there was also about $2 million of savings. Even after they revised it to the $27 million budget, the Starretts came in at $25 million. So it did come in under budget. Most of that was because of the Depression, but some of it was because of time savings during construction too. And I think there are two key reasons to why the project came in under budget. One was it was designed from the beginning with functionality and economy in mind. And so the entire design of the building, we talked about the Art Deco with the limited ornamentation, was in service of this goal of being under budget, having a less expensive building. And also, I think because it was accomplished so quickly, it was started and completed before it could become bloated. So I think a lot of times when you see these projects like some of the government military procurement projects or some like really long construction projects, they become more expensive as they last longer because they just become bloated. Their design changes. The initial assumptions when you started the project are no longer true. And so finishing the project quickly was also in a lot of ways kind of a hedge against increased cost.
Yeah, well, and another theme that really sticks out to me for budgeting is the alignment of incentives here. In this case, the owners went with a fixed fee cost structure, which meant that the Starrett brothers were incentivized to finish as fast as possible and at lowest cost as possible because they ultimately reaped any cost savings as pure profit. And so I think this alignment of incentives was a huge factor in making the project ultimately come under budget.
Yeah, I totally agree. The incentives being aligned was probably the most important factor in finishing under budget and ahead of time. So to talk a little bit about the schedule too, how they were able to finish ahead of time. So one caveat to this, and what we talked about a little bit during the story, was buildings today are just more complex. So comparing the Empire State Building to a modern day office building is kind of like apples and oranges, because today modern day office buildings have a lot more systems. There's information technology, air conditioning that the Empire State Building didn't have, security systems. As a product, if you think about it, it's like an iPhone compared to a flip phone. But then another reason for buildings taking longer to construct today that I think comes up a lot is the more strict permitting, safety, and just regulations around building construction. And so there's two ways to look at this. On one end, you could be really cynical and you could say that it's just a bunch of regulation and red tape that is slowing down construction today. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you could say that, well, we're getting a lot of benefits from some of the regulation because there are increased safety standards. There's not guys dancing around on steel beams without a harness today. The quality of life for workers is much higher. There's healthcare and benefits and much better safety equipment.
Regulations around working hours.
But then also just like environmental regulations that, are actually beneficial. So we talked a little bit about when they were demoing the Waldorf Astoria, they just dumped the debris in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, today they're not doing that. And that's probably a benefit to society and our environment. So I think in reality, it kind of comes down somewhere in the middle where, yes, there is a lot of regulations and bloat and red tape, but there also are some benefits that we get from the regulations. So there's this tension between the speed of construction and the overall benefit to society and everyone involved. Another takeaway for me from this story, and we talked about it a lot during the construction section, but it's the importance of logistics in any project, really. And for me, this is an example of the idea that God is in the details, and details matter. A complex project like the Empire State Building is the culmination of millions of small little details and decisions. And individually, they seem insignificant, but when you group them all together, they have a large impact on the overall project. And so we talked about schedule and budget. The fact that the project came in under budget and ahead of schedule was the result of millions of little decisions made at every step of the process. And so I think as project managers, the idea to approach this is that first you need to frame the problem correctly. And so the Starrett brothers did this by understanding the problem kind of from a first principles standpoint. And if you remember, their idea was that they viewed the construction as essentially a material transport problem, and then they optimized construction to handle materials as few times as possible. So I think the strategy here is you want to frame the problem correctly and then work on optimizing your solution. And so for the Starretts, this took the form of their obsession with logistics, where they had the expediters riding on the train cars to deliver the steel beams to reduce the risk of any time delays. They also perfected the process of moving bricks on site. And that might seem like a small improvement, but when that's added up with all the other improvements and optimizations they made, this all added up to ultimately achieving their goal. But then what sticks out to me also from a project management perspective is once you realize that there's these 10,000 activities that need to be optimized and how you can optimize them, you also need to create a framework to manage all these activities, especially on a complex project. You can't be tracking every single expediter, moving every single steel beam and each individual brick that's moved on site. And so to me, the genius of the Starretts was also creating this idea of the 4 pacemakers, which basically collapses this complex web of decisions and tasks into just a simple structure of 4 ideas that they can manage. So they know that, okay, as long as we're meeting these 4 pacemakers, we're on track.
So then I imagine from a project management perspective, the hardest part would be picking your pacemakers.
So what do you think, Stephen? What role do you think the emphasis on logistics played in the success of this project?
To me, logistics is fundamentally the problem. I really agree with this take because the amount of time it takes to construct a building, at least in my mind, is the amount of time it takes to execute each task, plus the amount of time the executors are blocked waiting for something to arrive, like a steel beam or something. So it's probably harder to make people execute faster. At the end of the day, I think you have to kind of trust people are going to go as fast as they can. But if they're sitting there waiting and doing nothing, that's really, really bad. So you really want to optimize that and make sure that everyone is unblocked. So to me, this is one massive logistics problem, and it's absolutely correct to think about it from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think the mental model that makes this possible is looking at it from a first principles perspective. Because if you think from first principles, what is a skyscraper? What is a building? It's just an assembly of a bunch of different materials put together on one site. And that's a dramatic simplification. But when you think about it from that perspective, it's like, okay, then the critical path is going to be how do we get these materials to site and assembled in the correct way? All right, Stephen, I have one more leadership lesson that I'm really excited to talk about. And it's this idea that as a leader, you want to have a long-term mindset and you want to look beyond just the numbers when you're making a decision. So there's a quote from Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 where he says, "If you focus on near-term growth above all else, you miss the important question you should be asking. Will this business still be around a decade from now? Numbers alone won't tell you the answer." And so you could substitute business here with any decision or idea that you're trying to make. And this really sticks out to me when we think about Raskob's decision to build the tallest building in the world. So if you were taking just a short-term approach and you were just looking at the numbers, you would look at that analysis the architects did that said a 63-story skyscraper is the most economically sound to build. But Raskob knew that there was more to that analysis than just the numbers, and he took this long-term view and correctly realized that having the undisputed tallest building in the world would offer these priceless intangible advantages. And for me, putting this in Peter Thiel's framework, being the tallest in the world gave the Empire State Building a monopoly on the world's tallest building. And that was something that differentiated it from other office buildings and allowed its owners to charge a rental premium.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Will, but this quote by Peter Thiel really does stand out to me because I feel countless times in my job, people tend to just gloss over the question of, will this matter in 10 years?
And then to me, the genius of the modern day Empire State Building is that it's been able to recreate itself into another monopoly because it lost this height crown. It's no longer the tallest in the world, but now it's created another unique differentiation. And it's basically a brand that's synonymous with New York, and it's become a New York City landmark that's just as much a part of New York as the Statue of Liberty, Central Park, or even the yellow taxi cabs.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This icon was the result of long-term thinking, ultimately. What can you not stop thinking about when it comes to the Empire State Building?
To me, there's a lot of ideas that really stick out, but the one I've been thinking about the most is this idea that it's not just enough to build the tallest building in the world. You also have to sell that idea to your customer or to the public. And just how important it was to have Al Smith. You know, when I first heard this story about the Empire State Building, I thought that Al Smith was included in this project basically as like a mild political kickback, but really he was integral to the story of the Empire State Building and selling the fact that it was the tallest in the world, but then also building the foundations of the modern day legacy. And to me, you can draw a straight line from that idea back to Al Smith and hiring Bell Moskowitz to promote the building and make it an American icon outside of New York City too. And so really just this idea that it's not enough to accomplish this great engineering feat. You also have to tell a story around it.
All right, Will, so that's the end of Project Blueprint's episode on the Empire State Building.
If you'd like to know every time we release a new episode, join our mailing list using the link in the show notes. It's the only place where we share updates, corrections, and bonus material that didn't make it into the show.
Now listen, guys, if you enjoyed the show, you should leave us a review. It really, really helps. And also, please share this with a friend who's interested in technology, leadership, or just a good story.
We'd also love to hear from you. Send your feedback or episode ideas to hello@projectblueprint.fm or check the link in the show notes.
Thanks so much for listening to Project Blueprint. I'm Stephen Lasky.
I'm Will Heinzel.
And we'll see you next time.